CD10.
As dusk fell, Kurt and Joe were driven to an American air base and a battleship gray C-17 that sat on the tarmac, illuminated by a series of floodlights. They entered from the tail ramp, cleared by a loading officer who was busy strapping down a Humvee and some other tarp-covered equipment, and were offered seats near the front. Kurt dropped into his seat, dejected and exhausted. Joe offered a few jokes to cheer him up, but Kurt didn't have it in him. He sat in silence and stared straight ahead as the huge four-engine transport taxied and then took off into the dark sky. As they climbed to altitude, Joe fell asleep, but Kurt found he couldn't close his eyes. He racked his brain for one more avenue to explore, one tiny thing they might have missed that could lead them to Sienna, the other hackers, and whoever was behind a plot that Kurt was certain hadn't truly begun to unfold yet. Try as he might, he came up empty. And as the drone of the engines and the chill of the cabin numbed him, he stood and walked toward the front, stopping to stare through the small window in the aircraft door. The sky was dark up ahead, but with a line of light on the horizon. Silver lining, Kurt thought. How ironic. As drained as he was, it took Kurt a minute to realize that there should not be a silver lining up ahead. If they were headed to Guam, they would be flying into the teeth of the night. They'd only been airborne a few hours, and despite the time zone change, it couldn't be anywhere near dawn yet. He looked backward. The sky behind them was pitch black. "We're going the wrong way," he said to himself. Before he could hazard a guess as to why, the cockpit door opened and a familiar figure stepped out. "Hiram?" Kurt said. Seeing Hiram Yeager outside of the Numa building was like running into the high school principal out on the town somewhere. It was off-key somehow. Adding to that effect was Hiram's clothing. Instead of his trademark T-shirt and jeans, Yeager was zipped up in an olive-drab military flight suit with his ponytail tucked up into an Air Force ball cap pulled down tight over the top of his head. "Are you undercover?" Kurt asked, half joking. "In a way I am," Yeager replied. "Dirk wanted me to brief you in person." "Brief me about what?" "The mission." Kurt paused. "I thought there was no mission," he said. "In fact, Tim Hale gave me the distinct impression that if I pushed it any further, I might end up in a stockade somewhere." Hiram laughed. "Hale is actually rather fond of you, from what I hear. He was very impressed with everything you two accomplished in such a short time." "So why the cold shoulder?" "It was for Colonel Lee's benefit," Yeager said, "and anyone else who might have been listening for that matter. We think the Korean security database has been hacked, and we're not too sure about our own or the DOD's, so we figured we'd lay out a story for Colonel Lee to enter into his system while I came here with handwritten notes to get you up to date." "Handwritten? That must have been hard for you," Kurt joked. "You have no idea," Yeager replied. "Might as well be using a slide rule or an abacus." Kurt laughed, happy to see a friendly face in an unexpected place for the second time in as many weeks. "So, what tidings do you bring, O messenger of the realm?" Yeager waved at a pair of seats that faced each other. Kurt took one seat as Hiram sat across from him and zipped the flight suit down far enough to pull out a manila folder he had tucked inside. "An awful lot has happened while you were napping in that Korean hospital." "Good or bad?" "A little of both," Hiram said. "As soon as Joe positively identified Sienna Westgate among the group of people that had been smuggled out of North Korea, the administration went into overdrive. Brian Westgate was called in to explain himself. In the middle of a tirade about how Phalanx was unbreakable, even if someone had Sienna in their clutches, he suffered a mental breakdown of some kind and what we thought was a stroke. Turns out he'd been given the same treatment as you. They pulled a chip from his occipital lobe. A team from the FBI found prescription drugs in his house that had been tampered with and laced with memory-inhibiting compounds. He's recovering and under guard for his own protection." "Does he remember anything?" Kurt asked. "Not much. Seems they worked his mind over worse than yours." Kurt sat back. He'd harbored a natural dislike of the internet billionaire ever since he'd learned of Sienna's engagement to him, and from the beginning of this mystery he'd been certain Westgate had some part in it. Finding out that Westgate had been given the same rough treatment and had been used as a pawn in some bigger scheme put Kurt in the odd place of feeling he'd misjudged the man. He could only imagine what was going through Westgate's mind at this point. "They pulled him from the yacht," Kurt said, remembering what he'd heard. "After they escaped in that pod and the storm had passed, they put him in that raft and waited for someone to find him." Yeager nodded. "Seems likely," he said. "The thing is, with both Brian Westgate and Sienna compromised, it's become obvious to everyone that Phalanx cannot be relied upon to protect the computer systems and networks it's been tasked with guarding." "What's being done about it?" Yeager sighed. "Everything that can be," he said. "A crash effort is underway to pull Phalanx and replace it with alternate systems. In addition, other security measures are being strengthened and reviewed. Some systems are being disconnected from the grid entirely." "A step in the right direction," Kurt said. "But when the people behind this mess realize that Sienna is no longer useful to them, neither she nor her children are going to last very long." "No," Yeager agreed. "The most likely outcome has them being killed. The group behind all this will simply start over. Whatever their ultimate goal is, they've spent considerable time and energy trying to bring it to life. Nothing we've seen suggests they would give up." "Any idea what they're up to?" "We've detected a massive increase in hacking attempts, but no clear pattern," Yeager said. "We think they're trying to disguise their true objective." "Which means we have to find them," Kurt urged. "The only way this ends is if we stop it at the source." Yeager nodded. "And that brings me to why you're here and flying west with the night instead of east to Guam. We have a new lead, and strangely enough, you're the one who gave it to us." As he spoke, Yeager pulled another photograph from the file folder. Kurt had seen it before. It was the picture he'd taken of Callista on the deck of Acosta's yacht. "Max has finished the facial recognition analysis on your mystery woman." "Any hits?" "Not at first," Yeager replied. "We checked through the civilized world's DMV bureaus, passport-issuing organizations, and court archives, even Interpol. No matching photographic record of this woman exists. So I asked Max to scan all publicly available images and see if we could find a counterpart." "There must be billions of photos out there," Kurt said. "Trillions," Hiram said. "Many trillions when you include video images. Even for Max it was a big task. Took 3 full days. And when she finally came up with an answer, I almost asked her if she was joking." "I didn't know computers could joke," Kurt said. Max has been known to pull a prank or two, but this time she was serious." Hiram produced another photo, this one copied from an old 3x5 glossy. It showed a handsome couple in their 30s. Gathered around them were 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who looked to be the youngest child. Judging by the clothes, the photo had probably been taken in the mid-'80s. "Nice-looking family," Kurt said. "Who are they?" "The woman's name is Abigail Bannister," Hiram said. "She was a telecommunications expert." Kurt studied her. Aside from the clothes, the woman could have been Callista's twin. "The man is her husband," Hiram continued. "Stuart Bannister. He was a satellite guidance specialist. They're English. They disappeared while on safari in Zimbabwe 28 years ago. At the time, there was some suspicion that they'd defected to the Eastern Bloc. It seems British intelligence had a low-level alert on them because of certain political beliefs and some old friends they'd made back in their college years. Though, for reasons that will become clear to you shortly, the world soon learned that such was not the case." Kurt had an idea where this was going. The woman looks just like Callista. And the little girl... "According to Max, her facial structure shows an 89% correlation with those of the woman you know as Callista. Once we did a computerized age progression, using her own features and those of her siblings and parents, we end up with a 96% correlation. For all intents and purposes, it might as well be a fingerprint match." "You're saying the little girl is Callista?" Yeager nodded. Kurt had great respect for what Hiram and Max could do. Certainly they'd pulled off near miracles before, but this seemed like a shot in the dark. Is there any way we can prove what you're suggesting? We already have, Yeager said. How? DNA analysis. Kurt raised an eyebrow. Where'd we get her DNA from? From you, Yeager said. You had Callista's blood all over you, not to mention a few strands of black hair caught in the buttons of your coat. Joe pointed it out to one of the CIA techs when he got to the hospital. They were smart enough to save the samples. We've since matched Callista's DNA with surviving relatives of the Bannister family. So the girl in this picture is Callista, Kurt said. Her real name is Olivia, Yeager said. They look so normal. Are you telling me these middle-class suburbanites left England, faked their disappearance, and started some kind of international crime family? No, Hiram said. The real story is much sadder than that. As I told you, they disappeared while on vacation. The father resurfaced 6 months later when he was shot to death in Bangkok. His hands were bound, his face was bruised, and he was clearly trying to escape from someone when he was gunned down. The responsible party was never found. A year after that, the bodies of the mother and the 2 boys were discovered. Where? In a dilapidated lifeboat drifting off the coast of Mozambique. Hiram passed another photo over, this one of the lifeboat as it was discovered. The 3 bodies were covered, but there were several containers at their sides. Here and there, Kurt saw patches to the rotting wooden boat and a pair of makeshift oars. In one corner was a broken splint of wood and a tattered bolt of cloth that might have been used as a mast and sail. They died of dehydration, Hiram explained. No water in those containers? Kurt asked. Perhaps at first, Yeager said. But if that's what they held, it wasn't enough. Based on the condition of the bodies, the coroner guessed they'd been in the boat for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Not enough water for 3 people for that much time. Not even if those containers were filled to the brim. Kurt looked back at the photo of the smiling family and guessed at the sequence. Somehow Callista got left behind. Maybe they knew there wasn't enough water for 4 and were hoping 3 could make it. Who knows? Hiram said. The only thing we're sure of is that the smiling little girl in that picture has been with whoever took her for almost 3 decades. She doesn't know, does she? She may remember some of it, Hiram cautioned. She would have been 4 when they were abducted, 5 going on 6 when her mother and brothers made what we can only assume was a desperate attempt to escape. But considering what we've learned about people in captivity, it's highly probable that whatever memories she had of the situation have been suppressed. Between Stockholm Syndrome and the human desire to survive, the mind can be bent into accepting even the strangest of things. In her case, as a young child, it would probably have been as simple as just making her part of a new family. Kurt considered the irony. She's gone from abductee to abductor. She wouldn't be the first. Kurt nodded. Looking at the photo, he felt sorry for the little girl who'd become Callista. But his main concern was the madness she and her partners were now spreading over the world. So this is a break for us, he said. If we find the people who took her, we find the mastermind behind all this. Exactly our thinking, Hiram said, which leads us to a leap of faith. Take a look at the old lifeboat in the picture. Can you make out the name stenciled on the upper plank? Kurt squinted. He could see a discoloration, but that was it. He shook his head. Here's an enhanced photo. Kurt took the new printout. Computer augmentation had made the name more legible. Kurt read it twice to be sure, and then a 3rd time. I know you wouldn't be joking at a time like this, but are you certain? Hiram nodded. The Waratah? Kurt said. The Blue Anchor Line's Waratah that vanished in 1909? One and the same, Hiram said. Between St. Julian Perlmutter's vast number of records on the subject and a South African who spent years looking for the Waratah, we've confirmed that she had 2 double-enders of exactly this type among her complement of auxiliary craft and lifeboats. Kurt stared at the name on the photo. It certainly looked correct, but it seemed impossible. "It's got to be a mistake," he said. "Logic would tell you that," Hiram agreed, "except that I know something you don't. The Waratah never went down." With that, Hiram pulled out another photograph. On it, Kurt saw a derelict vessel covered in sediment, corrosion, and what Kurt guessed to be vegetation. She didn't have much shape to her. "I present the SS Waratah," Hiram said, "discovered by Paul and Gamay Trout 3 days ago adrift in the southern reaches of the Indian Ocean." Kurt looked at the photo. He realized that Hiram wouldn't be joking about such a thing, not at this point, but it boggled his mind and he had to make sure. "You're serious?" Yeager nodded. "How is it possible?" Hiram explained their theory about how the sediment she was buried in stunted the corrosion on her hull, and what Gamay and Elena found in her sickbay. "We're operating on a theory that a violent group took over the ship," he continued, "and sailed her north." "Any idea where she ended up?" Hiram nodded. "The west coast of Madagascar," he said, then followed up by explaining how Gamay had led them to that answer, passing yet another photo from the file to Kurt. 2 satellite images were printed on the photo side by side. They showed a muddy river snaking and turning. "Before and after," Yeager explained. "The picture on the left is 2 months old. The picture on the right was taken last week." Kurt's eyes went right to a highlighted section where the channel bent 90 degrees and then ran out to the sea. In the older photograph, there was a large obstruction, like a hill or sandbar, that seemed to force the bend. In the newer photo, the hill was gone. The river had carved out a new course, and the channel had widened and straightened substantially. "Torrential rains last month scoured a new route to the sea," Hiram said. "They took everything in their path along with them, including the hull of the SS Waratah. The hill in question matches her dimensions almost perfectly." Kurt rubbed the stubble on his chin. "So the Waratah was hijacked and stashed in this river, not lost at sea like everyone thought. 80 years pass, and the Bannisters, being held captive, discovered her, patched up one of her lifeboats, and tried to sail to safety, leaving 5-year-old Olivia behind. They don't make it. The hijackers keep the young girl and slowly indoctrinate her. All these years later, we have Callista to deal with." Hiram nodded. "You'd have made a good detective," he said. And with that, he presented one last piece of the puzzle. This time, the image depicted a large plantation-style estate, complete with hedges shaped into a complex maze, terraced gardens, a large pool, and various other structures. A row of satellite dishes sprouted along one side of the main building, while a helipad with a moderate-sized hangar lay on the other. Kurt could see the tails of 2 military-looking helicopters sticking out of the hangar. The property was sprawling, and the grounds beyond the walls looked like pasture land. Kurt could see livestock roaming free. At the very top of the property was a jagged bluff of weathered gray stone. It ran the entire width of the photo. "This compound is 5 miles upriver from the spot where the Waratah was hidden. It's owned by a mysterious but powerful man named Sebastian Brevard. For 4 generations, the Brevard name has been connected with various types of criminal activity: money laundering, bank fraud, trafficking in weapons, and stolen goods. But strangely, there is no record of their existence before 1910, when they purchased this large tract of land." "I'm guessing documents were fairly scarce back then," Kurt said, "especially in Madagascar." "Yeah, you'd be surprised," Hiram said. "The fact is, from 1897 to 1960, the island was part of the French Empire. In the land purchase records filed with the colonial governor's office, the Brevard family claim emigration from France and a distant level of nobility. However, the coat of arms they lay claim to is made up. It has no true heraldic provenance in the annals of French society. Nor is there any record of a wealthy French family bearing the Brevard name leaving France for warmer pastures during that time." Kurt saw what Hiram was getting at. So this false band of nobles appears out of nowhere 6 months after the Waratah goes missing, and they buy the land on which the ship is hidden, presumably to keep it that way. Not just the land where the ship was hidden, Hiram corrected, but a mile-wide swathe all the way from the water's edge up to this impassable outcropping of granite. I think I can guess where the money came from, Kurt said. Jewels, gold, and cash stolen from the passengers and crew of the Waratah. Our thoughts exactly, Hiram said, supplemented, we now think, by a stack of counterfeit notes that were considered among the best ever produced during that era. Kurt sat back and considered the implications. It seemed likely that Sienna's kidnappers were the same group of thugs who'd abducted and destroyed the Bannister family 30 years before. Beyond that, the evidence suggested they were descended from a group that pirated the Waratah back in 1909. Instead of anger, Kurt felt only a cold determination to put an end to their destruction. I guess the apple really doesn't fall far from the tree, he said. Any idea who they really are? Where they came from? It's all speculation, Yeager said, but a band of criminals known as the Claw River Gang had been terrorizing Durban through the winter of 1908 and into the summer of 1909. Records show that the gang fractured in a power struggle and turned on itself just as Durban police were about to round them up. Most of the members were killed, but several high-ranking associates were never accounted for. Despite initially thinking the gang had been wiped out, the chief inspector of the Durban police soon came to the conclusion that the leaders of the gang had escaped and had killed the others to cover their tracks. He stated publicly that he expected them to surface again, but they never did. Later in his life, he became enamored with the idea that they'd made their way aboard the Waratah and perished when it went down. What made him think that? Timing, for one, Yeager said. They'd vanished 2 days before the Waratah sailed. But there was another reason as well. Counterfeit 10-pound notes eventually surfaced in the Blue Anchor Line's payroll, very hard to distinguish from the real thing. It was assumed that some tickets had been purchased with the notes, and that's how they got into the office's cash box. Similar notes and burned fragments were found at the gang's hideout. Kurt thought he saw the line of reasoning clearly at last. So the leaders fake their deaths and slip aboard the Waratah, paying for passage with forged notes, only to vanish with the ship. Even those who guess where they might have gone think that's the end of it, karma catching up with the gang or some grand cosmic rebalancing of the scales of justice. No one realizes they've hijacked the ship, taken it to Madagascar, and hidden it on this river. They use the wealth stolen from the passengers and their own forged banknotes to buy a new life. But instead of going straight, they slowly turn back to what they know. Crime. And every generation since has followed the pattern. That's about the size of it, Hiram said. If we're even half right, I think it's time we put an end to it, Kurt said. Any chance we have the Delta Force or a team of Navy SEALs standing by? Afraid not, Hiram said. A strike force is being readied. Believe me, no one back home is happy with what's going on, or with the possibility that such a prominent American is being used and held by a group as unsavory as this bunch. But there are logistical problems. Such as? For one, we have no proof, Hiram said. Beyond that, even if our theory is correct, we can't be sure that the cyber attacks are emanating from this compound, or that Sienna and the others are there. If we tip our hand and ask for help from the government of Madagascar, we'll lose the only advantage we have going, the element of surprise. You need boots on the ground to get you proof, Kurt said. Hiram nodded solemnly. That's where you and Joe come in. It's strictly volunteer at this point, but we'll be crossing over Madagascar in a few hours. That puts you and Joe 4 hours closer than the next best option. You know I'm game, Kurt said, and I'm sure Sleeping Beauty back there won't want to miss out on all the fun. But what happens once we get proof, assuming we can find it? Call it in and sit tight, Hiram said. Special forces will do the rest. Kurt liked that idea, but there was one concern. What if the Bravards know that Special Forces is being readied? They've been one step ahead of us all along. Not this time, Hiram said. Like my trip out here to see you, all orders and logistics connected to this operation are being drafted up on old-fashioned typewriters and hand-carried to the commanders in question. The Bravards can tap all the computers they want, but they won't find what isn't there. And if they do look, what they'll discover is misinformation. Right now, the NUMA database, the Air Force database, and even the International Air Traffic Control System show this plane winging its way to Guam. Orders putting you back on medical leave have already been set in motion, while Joe's being reassigned to a whale-watching mission off the coast of Venezuela. In the meantime, a CIA threat assessment has labeled Acosta as the prime suspect, putting him in league with the Iranian Cyber Force and North Korea's Unit 121. Kurt grinned. That's not bad. If this Bravard guy has taken a peek into our systems, he's probably feeling awfully good about himself right now. We might even catch him flat-footed. We might at that, Hiram said. Kurt stood up, stretched, and glanced back toward Joe. I'll go wake Joe. I think we'll need some coffee. Chapter 48. Sebastian Brevard, his brother Laurent, and his sister Callista stood in the control room surrounded by computers discussing the situation. I've brought all the men in, Laurent said. We have a total of 50 at this point, but they are sitting around with nothing to do. When do you expect this attack to occur? Sooner or later, Sebastian explained. I'm monitoring their most important channels. We have nothing to worry about at the moment. In the meantime, we are spending a fortune on these hired guns, Laurent said. I'm sure our regulars would have done just fine. Sebastian dismissed his brother's whining. It doesn't matter, he said. A pittance compared to what we'll control. I don't see why we have to draw them in, Callista said. Sebastian glanced toward her as he sat at his own workstation. How many times have I told you, dear sister? A con is never about convincing your mark to do any particular thing. They must convince themselves to take action, firm in their belief that it was their idea all along. That I understand, she said, but why bring them here? To make this work, they must attack with vengeance and retribution in their eyes. The carnage and annihilation it brings will make the world think we are dead. It will make them think this sordid chapter in their pitiful lives is over, and the threat effectively neutralized. Only then will we be truly hidden and able to act with impunity. I told you I would give us a new life, one where no one is looking for us. And I shall. For the first time she could remember, he moved closer to her. Instead of the stern older brother, there was something more in his eyes. It made her uncomfortable in a way she was used to making others uncomfortable. What about the hostages? She asked, pulling back. He looked at her with disappointment. For the second time in as many weeks, you seem concerned with something other than our family. Are you feeling all right? I just need to know, she snapped. They can identify us, Sebastian explained. To prevent that, they will be destroyed in the conflagration. Their quarters are lined with napalm, much like the explosives that line our home. When the attack comes and the firefight begins, I will detonate the charges and the whole place will go up in flames. Make sure you're on the helicopter with me when it does. She smiled, the slightly sadistic smile he was more used to. Of course, dear brother. Where else would I be? Good, he said. Now, bring Sienna Westgate to me. I have at least one last job for her. Callista nodded and left. With the door shut tight, Laurent re-engaged Sebastian. She's getting soft, he said. Well, Sebastian said, it's to be expected. She's not really one of us, is she? Laurent smiled. Both he and Sebastian had enjoyed taunting her when she was a child. It had been a game. They both knew who and what she was. They were surprised by what she became, how strongly she bought into the family. In many ways, she'd always seemed intent on proving herself, as if she knew deep down inside that she didn't belong. You know her purpose as well as I do, Sebastian continued. They will find her body and that of 2 others in the downed helicopter. Burned, perhaps, but considering the jewels and treasures they'll discover on board, there will be no choice but to assume it is the 3 of us. You and I will escape in the tunnel and destroy it behind us. I have rigged the explosives to go off in an acceptable progression. The outer buildings first, then the wings of the mansion, and finally the control room and the tunnel. It will give us extra time to escape. Sienna Westgate sat with her children in a 1-story windowless lodge that was the communal prison of the hostages and their family members. In an effort to shield her children from any more pain, Sienna's trip to Iran and then Korea had been called a vacation. She'd promised them she would come back quickly, though she obviously had no control over when or if she would return. And the feeling of her children's tears had remained with her all during her absence. Her arrival back at the compound was met with smiles and kisses, and she wrapped her arms around them so tightly that she almost squeezed the air out of them. But after a brief moment of euphoria, Sienna began to fall into a pit of despair. She could see that constant fear and stress had already taken its toll on them. Elise had become withdrawn and quiet, the opposite of her outgoing nature. Her face looked pale and gaunt, as if she weren't being fed or was unwilling to eat. Tanner was worse. He had a fever and insect bites all over his legs. He quickly became demanding and angry. He wanted his father. He wanted to go home. He hated it there. Sienna hated it too, but there was nothing she could do about it. She'd given in to her captors and done everything they'd asked, everything any of them had asked, all to keep the children safe and buy them some time. But now her spirit was beginning to weaken. Video she'd seen of her husband talking to the press as if she and the kids had drowned was confusing and disheartening to her. He knew she'd been abducted. He was there. He'd seen it with his own eyes. She only hoped it was a ruse and that rescue would eventually come. But she now doubted it, especially after what she allowed to happen to Kurt and his friend in Korea. Seeing them appear out of nowhere had been like a dream, but when Callista had gained the upper hand, Sienna had no choice but to obey her. Her only solace was that, given another chance, she would make the same choice. She couldn't face life knowing she'd chosen freedom and left her children behind. If they were going to die, she wasn't going to let them face it alone. The door to the room opened. Everyone looked up. 2 of Brevard's men stood there. Callista was with them.
"Sienna,"
she said. Sienna stood, but her children refused to let go, clinging to her hands, gripping her fingers.
"Don't go,"
Elise cried.
"It's okay," she said. "I'll be right back." "Mommy!"
Tanner was screaming. Sienna dropped down to their level and squeezed them together. Tanner broke out in tears. Elise looked almost numb at this point.
"I'll be right back," she told them. "Take care of each other."
As Sienna stood, another woman, who was married to the hacker named Montresor, came to her assistance.
"I watched them for you,"
she said. If there was one positive to this communal prison, it was that they weren't alone.
"Thank you."
Sienna left with the guards and followed as they led her along the pathway from what had once been the servants' quarters and up to the main house. Sienna glared at Callista.
"You must have a heart of stone." "If I have a heart at all,"
Callista replied proudly. Sienna dutifully climbed the steps that led to the main compound, and from there was led through the security doors to the control room. She began to feel sick as she approached, knowing that Sebastian Brevard would be waiting on the other side, ready to order her to use her skills and the offensive capabilities of Phalanx against a new target, as he'd done each night since her return. The day would come when he asked her to do something truly evil, and she would have to decide between her children's lives and the lives of countless others. She almost prayed he would shoot her before then. Tonight's targets are the power plants in California, Sebastian said. We'll start with the regular ones. I just want a large rolling blackout. Think of all the coal and natural gas that will be saved. Sienna sat at the console as ordered and began to work. She'd long contemplated hiding a message in the code she was supposed to send. Someone smart enough on the other side might find it, even if it slipped under the noses of Sebastian and Callista. But the only message of any value would be to tell the world where she was. And that was something she didn't know. Considering the climate, the strange bird calls she heard at night, and some odd trees she'd seen in the distance, she figured they were somewhere in Africa. But that didn't exactly narrow it down. She settled in and did as she was told. For now, that was all she could do. At that very moment, 500 miles north of Madagascar, the USS Bataan, an amphibious assault ship sometimes referred to as a helicopter carrier, was steaming at flank speed to the south. She was rigged for battle, blacked out, and operating under strict radio silence. But while she could not transmit, she was capable of receiving messages. Late on the second watch, a member of the communications crew overheard several puzzling messages and reported them to the officer in charge. The officer looked at the messages and then at the radio man. "What's the problem, Charlie?" "It's these intercepts, sir. Someone is using our call sign. They're transmitting and receiving uncoded messages and giving out our old location." The communications supervisor studied the transmission sheet. "Yep," he said. "Looks that way." Without another word, he handed the sheet back to the radio man and turned his attention to other matters. The radio man stared at him, dumbfounded. "You have a post demand, sailor." "Yes, sir," the radio man said, turning and heading back to his console. Something was obviously going on, but having seen the look on his superior's face, Charlie knew better than to ask. Meanwhile, down on the hangar deck of the ship, a swarm of mechanics and technicians worked on a group of UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters, making sure all 5 were in perfect shape for the mission. In a nearby ready room, 46 Marines, comprising 2 Force Recon platoons, were getting briefed on the island compound they were about to attack. "We go in under cover of darkness," Lieutenant Brooks told the men. "Secure the perimeter and then search the grounds and buildings with the following objectives. First, to rescue Ms. Westgate and her children. Second, to rescue any other civilians found on the site. Third, to capture the individuals responsible. Fourth, to gather any intelligence regarding their activities or associates." "Are we going in as friendlies?" someone asked. "Negative," Brooks replied. "We have not been invited, and we will not be overstaying our welcome. From wheels down to departure, we have no more than 40 minutes, so don't get lost in the hedges." A wave of laughter went around the room. "How many defenders are we likely to encounter?" "Based on the 2 bunkhouses and the size of the main structure, it could be anywhere from 30 to 50, but not all of those will be armed combatants. Honestly, it should be a walk in the park. Just be ready in case it isn't." 30 minutes later, the Force Recon Marines were up on the flight deck and boarding the Blackhawks. A long, grueling stretch awaited them. 4 hours of flight time that included refueling the helicopters from a tanker aircraft approximately 100 miles from the target. Assuming they went in and got out in 40 minutes, the total trip would be 8 hours. At least the journey home would be shorter, as the ship would be nearly 200 miles closer by the time they reached it. With the pilots going through their pre-flight checks and the Marines boarding their helicopters and stowing their weapons, the company commander made his way over. He spoke briefly with Lieutenant Brooks. "We have the green light to launch, but you won't get attack authorization until we have confirmation that Ms. Westgate and her children are on site." "Understood," Brooks said. "Any idea how or when we're going to get that?" The commander checked his watch. "A 2-man team will be making a LAPES insertion several miles from the compound. They should be on the ground any time now. They'll have a ways to go before they're on site, but I would expect a go or no-go decision shortly after you refuel." Brooks nodded. "LAPES insertion? Who'd they sucker into pulling that duty?" "A couple of guys from Numa." Brooks stared at the commander blankly for a moment. "Numa? Aren't they a bunch of marine biologists or something? There's something, all right, the commander said with a strange look on his face. Anyway, I'm told these guys are good. Right, sir, Brooks said with disdain in his voice. I'll expect our cover to be blown and to be looking for more hostages or dead bodies when we land. The commander didn't respond, but he shared the assessment. Crack open the operations file once you get airborne. There are photos of the Numa personnel inside. Make sure you're familiar. Don't want to shoot them if they happen to survive. Good luck. Brooks offered a salute, received one back from the commander, and then climbed aboard the lead Blackhawk. As the rotors above him began to turn, he wondered what kind of oceanographer or marine biologist would be up for such a stunt, or how such a person would even have the skills to perform what they were being asked to do. With a shrug of his shoulders, Brooks decided they had to be half crazy, whoever they were. At least they had guts. He'd give them that. Chapter 49. Had they overheard Lieutenant Brooks's candid assessment of their mental health, Kurt and Joe might have agreed with him. Considering the odds alone, they were at least half crazy. Fortunately, the military had brought along a few items that would even the odds a bit. Kurt and Joe were changing into combat gear that was far more exotic than anything Kurt had ever heard of. The clothing looked more like a two-piece wetsuit than standard fatigues. It fit snugly and had some compression to it, bulging only where armored Kevlar pads covered the chest, thighs, and forearms. Feel like I'm suiting up for some futuristic sport, Joe said as he pulled the garment tight. Kurt laughed as he pulled his own suit on and ran his hands over the outer layer. Odd texture, he said. It feels like sandpaper. An Air Force staff sergeant named Connors explained the clothing. These are what we call infiltration suits, he said. The guys call them chameleon camo because of the way they work. There are 29,000 microsensors sewn into the exterior. They detect ambient light in all directions and change the color of the suit to match what is behind and around you. Try 'em out. Kurt found a small switch and clicked it to the on position. They went over and stood by the wall of the aircraft. The suit changed almost instantly from a dark navy blue to battleship gray. Where his right leg crossed in front of a black seat, the suit turned black. And where a yellow cable crossed behind him, a matching yellow strip crossed from his shoulder. He wasn't exactly invisible, but it looked like he'd been painted over to match the wall. Only his face and hands were obvious, and they would be covered by gloves and a hood once he was on site. That's incredible, Joe muttered. If you think they work well inside a brightly lit aircraft, the sergeant said, wait till you get on the ground. If you two aren't careful, you lose track of each other from 10 feet away. What about infrared? Kurt said. The suit has a cooling unit, Connors said. It'll counteract your body heat for about 30 minutes once you switch it on. After that, the exterior of the suit will start to warm up and you'll lose both your thermal protection and your chameleon-like powers. From that point on, you're just wearing expensive body armor. And I mean real expensive. Each of these suits costs more than you guys make in a year. Kurt switched his suit off and watched it return to a dark blue color in the time it takes a light bulb to dim. From there, the sergeant led them over to an equipment table that had been folded down from the wall of the cavernous aircraft. You'll breathe through these, he said, picking up two devices that looked much like divers' regulators. What's wrong with the air on the ground? Joe asked. We can't have your breath giving you away. Kurt chuckled. I told you to go easy on the onions. What can I say? Joe replied. I like a little flavor. It's not the odor, Connors explained. It's the heat. Breathing out vents a lot of hot air into the world, easy to spot on a thermal scope. No sense covering the rest of you in a cool suit if you're going to walk around with a plume of 98.6-degree vapor coming from your nose or mouth. He pointed to a lever on the front of the regulators. Twist this when you're ready to go dark. From then on, the regulator will mix cold air with every outgoing breath, effectively cooling it to the ambient air temperature and neutralizing the danger. How long will it last? As long as your compressed air holds out. Depends on your level of exertion. The tank is small, so you're looking at 15, maybe 20 minutes tops. Make sure you're through the outer layer of security by then. Both Kurt and Joe nodded. Next came the weapons and guidance equipment. First off, the sergeant strapped a gauntlet to Kurt's arm. It had a curved low-light screen on it. "Standard GPS, moving map display," he said. "It will illuminate with less than 1 candle power. You'll be able to read it with your night vision goggles on, but no one else will. Remember, this is military GPS, so it's good to within 3 feet." From there, they moved to a rifle rack. Connors handed them matching weapons. Once again, they were like nothing Kurt had ever fired. Considering how much he knew about guns, that was surprising. "Are these phasers?" Joe asked. "I've always wanted one." Connors chuckled. "Electromagnetic railguns," he said. "Completely silent. Accurate up to 1,000 yards. They fire ferrous projectiles. In other words, the bullets are made of iron, not lead, so they're more lethal in terms of penetrating anything they encounter. Also, since they don't require gunpowder, your standard-sized magazine carries 50 projectiles. You have a second magazine in your packs." Kurt held the weapon up, testing the weight and feel. It had a long barrel and was definitely nose-heavy. "How does it work?" Joe asked. "Superconducting magnets along the barrel and a high-potency battery pack. Pull the trigger and they accelerate the projectiles to 1,000 feet per second in the blink of an eye." Joe nodded approvingly. "Why are there 2 triggers?" Kurt asked. "Since they're already equipped with a substantial power source, someone got the great idea to add a long-range taser to the bottom rail. The lower trigger fires it. You can hit someone accurately up to 50 feet, or simply hold the tip of the barrel against them and give a half-pull to zap them manually." "So we don't have to kill everything we see?" Joe mentioned. The sergeant nodded. A red light went on at the far end of the aircraft, and they could feel the plane begin a rather steep descent. "We're approaching the drop zone," the sergeant said. "Any questions?" Joe raised a hand. "You said drop zone, but we don't seem to have parachutes." "You won't need them," Connors said. "You'll be going out in the Hummer." "Does it fly?" "Nope, but it can be put on a pallet and tossed out the back from an altitude of no more than 20 feet. Joe turned to Kurt. "You said we'd be using parachutes." "LAPES," Kurt said. Low-altitude parachute extraction system. It's all right there in the acronym. Joe shrugged, secured his weapon, and made his way toward the Humvee. "Why not? I'm open to new things, different experiences, novel ways of risking my neck in the name of science. So why not driving an SUV off an airplane moving at 150 knots? Somebody's got to do it." Both Kurt and the sergeant laughed. "Good luck," Connors said. Kurt nodded. "You want us to bring you anything back? T-shirt, postcard, puka shell necklace?" The sergeant grinned. "I prefer a shot glass that says 'We came, we saw, we conquered.'" Kurt returned the smile. "I'll see what I can do." 30 minutes later, Kurt and Joe sat belted into a Humvee that was secured to a sturdy wooden pallet and a harness that would deploy 2 large drogue chutes. Joe was harnessed in at the wheel, though he wouldn't actually do any driving during the insertion, as the danger of the wheels turning sideways and getting ripped off was far too great. Instead, the Humvee would use the pallet beneath it as a sled, while the parachutes trailing out behind them would both slow the vehicle down and keep them from nosing over. Kurt made one last check of his equipment. Out of an abundance of caution and a certain sense of nostalgia, he had added an additional weapon to his arsenal. Hidden in his pack was the Colt revolver that Mohammed el-Din had given him. He doubted he'd need it. But if the recent past had taught them anything, it was that modern technology was vulnerable to tampering or failing at precisely the wrong moment. That being the case, having a backup weapon from a bygone era didn't sound all that bad. He kept it zipped up in a front pocket that ran diagonally across the vest. For less logical reasons, he'd brought the pictures of Callista's family and the lifeboat they attempted to escape in. After searching for the truth so painfully himself, some part of him thought she deserved to know hers. The light on the wall turned yellow, and Sergeant Connors pressed a switch that opened the ramp at the tail end of the C-17. They were descending through 2,000 feet into utter darkness. The sea was below them for a moment, and then sand as they flew over the beach. As they flew lower and slower, the howl of the airstream whipping past the open door took on a different tone. With full flaps and its gear down, the C-17 could move incredibly slowly for such a huge machine. But the wake turbulence caused by flying at a high angle of attack in such a dirty condition created a buffeting and whining sound that seemed to trail behind the plane as if banshees were chasing it. On the map, the drop zone was labeled Ansilova Airport. Joe seemed concerned about that. "You think the people at this airport are going to be surprised when we drop out of the sky and drive off without stopping at customs?" "It's not much of an airport," Kurt said. "More of a dirt strip with a grass hut at the far end. We're only coming here because we need a flat surface to slide on. But there are no planes, no rental car desks, no white courtesy telephone." "No Admirals Club?" Joe said, looking perturbed. Kurt shook his head. "Sorry, buddy." Joe sighed. "I really have to talk to my travel agent. This trip is getting worse all the time." As Kurt and Joe waited for the light to go green, the pilots up front were easing the huge aircraft down over the trees. A crosswind coming down off the slope of the island was making it difficult, and they were actually flying sideways, a tactic pilots call crabbing. The problem was that they couldn't drop the Humvee in that alignment, or it would land sideways and flip, killing the occupants instantly. The co-pilot was on the instruments while the pilot flew with night vision goggles on. 90 feet AGL, the co-pilot said. "Can't get any lower until the tree's clear," the pilot replied. "We should be over the site in 10, 9, 8. The trees finally dropped away from under them, and the pilot saw the dirt strip stretching out before him in a long, thin line. He corrected to the left and brought the C-17 almost to the surface, stomping on the rudder to straighten the huge bird out. The C-17 was now 30 feet off the dirt strip, screaming at full power and headed for the trees 5,000 feet ahead. In a chair behind them, the loadmaster hit a switch, changing the jump light in the rear of the aircraft from yellow to green. "Release the payload," he said into the intercom. For what seemed like an interminable length of time, but was in fact only a few seconds, nothing happened except the trees ahead looming larger. Then the pilot felt the plane rise as the 5,000-pound payload was pulled out the back. At almost the same instant, Sergeant Connors' voice came over the intercom. "They're away! Payload clear! I repeat, payload clear!" In a synchronized move, the pilot jammed the throttles to full as the co-pilot retracted the gear to reduce the plane's drag coefficient. "Positive rate," the co-pilot called out, seeing the altimeter begin to move. The pilot heard, but did not reply. The dirt strip was only a mile long. The trees at the far end were no more than a few hundred yards away. It was a very tight window. "Climb, baby, climb," he whispered to the plane. With its engines screaming and its nose pointed skyward, the gargantuan aircraft clawed for altitude. It crossed the end of the dirt strip and pulled just clear of the trees, close enough that the mechanics who inspected her later would find streaks of green chlorophyll all across the underside of the fuselage. Clear of the danger, the pilot leveled off, picked up airspeed, and then turned to the southwest. In short order, they were out over the Mozambique Channel. Only now did the pilot consider the fate of the men they'd just dropped, wondering if they would live out the night. For their part, Kurt and Joe had wondered if they would survive the drop itself. It felt as if the plane was maneuvering desperately the last 30 seconds or so. As the light went green, Connors had pressed a red deploy button and shouted, "Go," or something along those lines. Neither Kurt nor Joe truly heard him, as the sound of the drogue chutes deploying and the sudden whiplash of being pulled backward out of the aircraft snapped their heads forward and commanded all their attention. The Humvee was yanked out of the aircraft and in free fall for all of 2 seconds. Kurt distinctly remembered the sight of the aircraft pulling up and banking to the right as the vehicle skidded across the dirt on the pallet like a toboggan out of control on an icy slope. The first sensation was like skipping a stone on a lake. And then they decelerated as the pallet maintained contact with the packed dirt of the runway. The last 40 or 50 feet seemed smoother. And then, suddenly, they lurched to a stop. Up ahead, the C-17 just barely cleared the trees, and Kurt was certain he saw brief fires in the treetops where the heat of the engines singed them. At that moment, just being alive was a thrill. Kurt looked over at Joe and saw him grinning from ear to ear. "Okay, I'd do that again," he said giddily. "I'd even pay for another ride." Kurt had to agree, but duty called. He opened the door and released the lock that connected them to the parachute and another lock that held them to the pallet. Joe performed the same task on the driver's side and then climbed back inside, turned the key, and brought the Humvee's 6.2-liter fuel-injected diesel to life. In a moment, they were speeding across the last 100 yards of the runway and onto a dirt road that led them south. "Hope you've got the map ready," Joe said, "'cause I'm not from around here." "Just stay on this road," Kurt said. "We got 7 miles to go."
End of CD 10. CD 11.
Chapter 50. With their infiltration suits switched off and well-worn robes covering them, Kurt and Joe raced along the dirt road in the Humvee. The landscape flying past in the dark was hard to see, but this section of Madagascar was made up of wide grassy fields, occasional copses of small trees, and plenty of sky. So far, they hadn't passed a single hut or another vehicle. Joe let off the gas to negotiate a bend in the dirt road, and they began to drift sideways as the rutted ground gave way beneath them. But with a slight punch of the throttle, the knobby tires bit a little deeper into the soil, and the four-wheel drive Humvee snapped back into a straight line and continued forward. Kurt was in the passenger's seat, holding onto the roll bar with one hand and checking the GPS with his other. "You always drive like this? You should see me at rush hour." "Something tells me I'd rather not." "First time I've ever been late for a meeting and not ended up in traffic," Joe said. "This section of Madagascar is pretty sparsely populated," Kurt said. "According to the map, the biggest town in a 50-mile radius is a place called Massaurivo, and it's only 8,000 people." "Lucky for us," Joe said. "Doubt we'll see another car out here." Kurt agreed. But livestock was another story. In sections where the rainwater had pooled, they'd passed grazing cattle and sheep. "Watch out for cows," he said. "As I recall, you hit one in the Azores and had to fight for the town's honor as part of your community service." "I was exonerated," Joe insisted. "A court inquiry ruled the cow to be at fault and fined her for grazing without a license." "We don't have time to go to court," Kurt replied, laughing at the memory. "Nor do we have a replacement front end handy. So just be careful." Joe promised he would do just that as they raced onto a straightaway and he stomped the gas pedal to the floor once again. A mile and a half from the Brevard property, they slowed. In place of blazing headlights, Joe and Kurt pulled on their night vision goggles. The Humvee became a growling beast of the night, hidden in the darkness. "I can see the fence up ahead," Kurt said. "Pull off the road here. We can hide the vehicle behind those trees." Joe allowed the Hummer to slow on its own. He manhandled the wheel and took them off the dirt road and onto the soft ground with its waist-high grasses. They came to a stop behind some low-lying brush and the wide trunk of a strange-looking tree that grew straight up like a concrete pillar. The only branches on the tree sprouted 70 feet above at the very top. It looked more like a giant stalk of broccoli than a tree. Several more of the odd trees grew close by. "I feel like I'm in a Dr. Seuss book," Joe said. "Baobab trees," Kurt said. "Trees like this won't give us a lot of cover." "We shouldn't need it with the suits," Kurt replied as he pulled off the oversized cotton tunic and rolled it into a ball. As Joe did the same, Kurt removed the night vision goggles and clipped the breathing regulator onto a notch at the shoulder. The small tank of compressed air that would be used to cool his breath was strapped to his side. He scanned the fence. It was rusted old barbed wire, already broken in places. There was no sign of anything more modern protecting the land at this point, but Kurt didn't want to chance it. "According to the GPS, it's about half a mile from here to the compound over this low dirge and then up a long slope," Kurt said. We need to cover that ground in no more than 10 minutes. That'll give us 15 minutes of thermal invisibility once we reach the compound walls. Joe nodded and slipped the sat phone into a zippered pocket of the infiltration suit. Into another pocket, he slid the extra clip for the railgun. I figure we travel as light as possible and leave the rest of this stuff behind. Couldn't agree more, Kurt said. Let's go. They switched on their suits, pulled the hoods over their heads, and readjusted the night vision goggles. Kurt took point crossing the road, heading into the tall grass on the other side, and moving quickly to a break in the fence. Joe followed, staying close. I'll give 'em this. These suits work as advertised, he said. I'm 10 feet behind you and really have to work just to see you. Even through these goggles, you're more of a shadow than anything else. I'm going to head straight for the point on this ridge, Kurt said. Stick close. If you get lost, give me a bird call or something. The only bird calls I know are Woody Woodpecker and Daffy Duck. That's despicable, Kurt said, lisping the words in his best imitation of the cartoon duck. Let's go. With that, Kurt was off. Joe followed, finding he could track Kurt more easily by the sound of his feet scuffing through the brush and grass and over the dusty soil of the higher ridge. They came down the other side of the ridge and onto a sloping field that ran all the way up to the granite formations behind the compound. At the base of those rocks, the lights of the plantation house were clearly visible. Kurt checked his watch. We have 30 minutes to confirm that the hostages are there and radio in. Any later, and the Marines will be turning around. Joe nodded, and Kurt began to move again. They couldn't run full out, but a brisk jog would do the trick. Halfway up, they encountered a small herd of zebu, the horned cattle seeming skittish at the approach of something they could smell but not see. They pricked up their ears, grunting and making strange gurgling noises deep in their throats. A few of them shuffled off, unnerved by the intrusion, but Kurt and Joe were long past them by that point, just shadows moving through the dark. As he continued up the slope, Kurt felt the ache in his shoulder from the bullet wound and the weight of the heavy railgun. He ignored it and continued on. 3/4 of the way up the slope, they came within sight of the compound walls. A quiet whistle got Joe's attention. They huddled together. What do you think? Kurt asked. The wall looks rough, unfinished. Probably hard to get stonemasons out here. Front gate has cameras, Joe said, studying the layout. Can't see any others. Kurt glanced along the dirt road that led up to the gate. If a pizza delivery guy came by right about now, that'd be ideal, but considering that isn't likely to happen, I say we climb the wall. I can see a spot over there where a tree is growing up beside the wall, Joe said. Too inviting, Kurt replied. Let's just use our hands and feet. Joe nodded again, and Kurt began to move, heading farther up slope. Joe followed, and the two met up again at the base of the stone wall. In a moment, they were over the top and inside, and the first thing they came to was the maze of manicured hedges. Unlike the gentle slope of the hill outside the walls, the grounds inside had been excavated and flattened. The entire compound was built on a series of terraces, with the lowest by the front gate, then 2 intermediate levels containing the hedge maze and the other small buildings, and finally the main house in all its grandeur sitting up on the highest of the 4 terraces. Unlike the rest of the grounds, the house was well lit. Kurt studied what he could from where he was. A pair of guards milled around the main entrance. At least one other man stood near the far side. Not exactly girded for battle, Kurt said. You say that like it's a bad thing. Just not used to so much going our way. Kurt ducked down behind the hedge and opened the flap that covered the GPS tracking unit strapped to his right arm. In dull gray and black tones, it displayed the grounds around them. There were 3 buildings on the lowest terrace that were considered possibilities. According to Hiram Yeager, men who appeared to be armed had been seen going in and out of all 3. We have to get to the other side of this maze, Kurt said. Do we risk going through it? Joe asked. The hedges are at least 6 feet high. They'll help keep us hidden. Kurt was about to say yes, considering that he had an overhead diagram of the maze displayed on his arm. But as he navigated the labyrinth in his mind, he discovered one salient feature. There was only one way in and one way out. Better go around, Kurt said. The maze has no other way out, It's a big circle that doubles back around and only takes you back to where you started. Considering how this undertaking has felt from day one, I'd say I've had about enough of that. Joe laughed. We still have 8 minutes of chameleon time. Kurt motioned to the right. Around that side. Stay close to the hedge. We should come across a building that looks kind of like a shed. This time, Joe led the way, and it was Kurt's turn to marvel at how rapidly he vanished, like a ghost in the fog. Kurt moved quickly to keep up, and on the far side of the hedge he came upon Joe. The shed-like building was right in front of them. Kurt was just about to step forward when a door opened and spilled some light onto the grounds. Kurt froze as 2 men came out, allowing the door to bang shut behind them. Leaning against the building, one of them lit a cigarette. The tip brightened to an orange-red hue as he inhaled. After releasing a puff of smoke, he turned to the other man. I'm telling you, Laurent is on the rampage. Don't get him angry right now or question him. I asked him about Acosta, and he told me to back off. Acosta is a gutless traitor, the other man said. He sold us out on one of Sebastian's deals. Mark my word, we're going to be at war with him soon. Next time you make a delivery, you watch your back. It's more than that, the smoking man said between drags on the cigarette. Sebastian is edgy. I think he's losing it. Been spending too much time with Calista. Both of them laughed at that. Who cares? The other man said. We just got paid. Now finish that smoke and get back in the game so I can take your money. The man with the cigarette laughed. Sure, he said. Set me up a drink. I'll be there in a minute. The first guy went back inside while the second man smoked for a moment longer before tossing the cigarette to the ground and crushing it out with his boot. As he finished grinding it into the dirt, he looked up, staring almost directly at Kurt. He lingered in that pose for a moment, the way a hunting dog might freeze as it pointed toward a sound its master couldn't hear. Kurt held perfectly still. Hidden in the shadows at a distance of 40 feet, he doubted the man could see him. All the same, he firmed his grip on the railgun and slid his gloved finger onto the trigger. The smoker held his place for another second, and then he turned, grabbed the door handle, and stepped back inside. Cover me, Kurt whispered. He moved quickly toward the door and placed his ear beside it. He heard the sound of a radio and voices. Too many voices. They were loud and boisterous, and as near as he could tell, all male. It sounded like a locker room inside. Convinced the prisoners were not present, he moved back to where Joe waited. Do we have the right address? Joe asked. Not unless you're looking for a frat party. I think this is a bunkhouse of some kind. Brevard's men are blowing off some steam. Joe looked around. So where to next? Kurt glanced down at the screen on his arm. The next building was 100 yards off, closer to the wall of the third terrace. Just up the road, Kurt said. Follow me if you can. Better be quick, Joe said. We turn back into pumpkins in less than 5 minutes. Moving past the building that housed Brevard's men, Kurt and Joe snuck onto another path. The next building was much like the first, low-lying and rather plain, without any windows, but it was guarded. 2 men at the door, one sitting in a chair with his feet propped up on a bucket, the other standing with a rifle over his shoulder. The main problem was a pair of exposed bulbs on a black wire above the entrance. The suits would not keep them hidden in that kind of glare. This has got to be it, Kurt said. I'm going to work my way around back and find the power line. Get in position. When I cut it, take the closest guy out with your taser. By the time the second guy figures out what's happened, I'll be on him. Sounds like a plan? As Joe moved to a new position, Kurt doubled back and went around the far side of the building. Moving quickly and quietly, he arrived at the far side of the structure and began looking for the power cable. He found a spot where a buried line came out of the ground and ran up the wall, held in place by rusted clamps. Pulling out his rubber-handled knife, Kurt sawed through the insulation and then with a quick cut, severed the cable. As the light spilling from the front of the building flickered and died, Kurt raced for the corner. He came around it just as Joe hit the standing guard with his taser. The man went stiff as a board but made no sound, and all Kurt heard was the rapid clicking and snapping sound that the taser made as it electrified the man's body and triggered his muscles into a rigid state. Realizing that something was wrong, the guard in the chair grabbed for his rifle, but Kurt was on him before he could bring it to bear. He clamped one hand over the man's mouth and yanked him backward, bringing the black carbon steel blade of the knife up against the man's throat. "You make a sound, it'll be your last," he warned the man. The guard went still and then nodded, his sense of shock growing as Joe appeared under the overhang like a specter materializing from another dimension. As Joe dropped down on the ground to truss up the other guard, his movements were a blur as the armor continuously changed both its color and texture. Kurt noticed the man he'd captured scrunching his eyes shut and then looking away as if he were hallucinating. "You people are holding some friends of ours," he whispered to his captive. "Are they here, in this building?" The guard nodded. Kurt glanced at Joe. "Check the door." Joe was already in the process. "Lock tight." "Keys," Kurt demanded. The guard reached a shaking hand into his breast pocket and pulled out a ring with 2 keys on it. Joe took the ring and went to work, finding 2 bolts, one for each key. Having unlocked the door, he cracked it open. "It's dark. I don't see anyone." "I must have cut the power to the entire building," Kurt said, pulling the guard to his feet. As Joe pulled the door open, Kurt pushed the guard through first in case someone attacked. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Looking around, Kurt saw a dozen people huddled in the far corner of the darkened room. They were hiding behind a pile of mattresses, a small table, and several chairs. He counted 3 men, 3 women, and 7 children of various ages. They seemed as frightened of him and Joe as the guards had been. After what they'd been through, Kurt didn't blame them. "It's all right," he said. "We're here to help you. We're getting you out of here." They seemed too afraid to respond, so Kurt flipped up his goggles and pulled out a flashlight, shining it on them. He didn't recognize most of the group, but 2 of the grimy-faced children looked like Sienna's son and daughter. "You're Tanner, right?" The boy nodded. "And you're Elise?" The girl was too afraid to say anything. She just stood there, gripping the hem of her shirt. "It's okay," Kurt said, brushing her hair back. "We're taking you home. Where's your mom?" Elise just stared at him, but Tanner pointed at the guards. "They took her." Kurt looked at the guard on his knees. "Where's Sienna Westgate?" "I don't know," the guy said. "They took her up to the main house, but I don't know where." One of the other adults came forward. He looked familiar. "I saw you in the tunnel in Korea," Kurt said. His English was vaguely European. Kurt guessed that Spanish, Portuguese, or even Italian was his first language. "You're Montresor," Kurt said, using his hacker name. The man nodded again. "My real name is Diego. I know where they took her. The man who runs things, Sebastian, he has a control room on the top floor. He watches everything from there, I think. Directly below him is a network series of high-end processors and computers. When they took me up to the house to work, that is where they kept me." "What do they have you do?" Kurt asked. "I hack into a system and edit programs. I create hidden doorways and what we call hides or blinds." "Those are hunting terms," Kurt said. "What do they mean in the programming world?" The man paused as if thinking of a way to explain it. "They're like black holes into which we can hide a virus. Even the most advanced antivirus software will not find it. And then at a later date, we activate the code." "And what does the code do?" Kurt asked. "I just create the blind," Montresor said. "Others build the virus." "And what does the virus usually do?" "Takes control of the system," he said. "Forces it to do something it is not supposed to do." Montresor, Kurt thought to himself. How perfect a handle for someone who hides things in a labyrinth where they will never be found. "What kind of systems did you hack? Pentagon? CIA?" Montresor shook his head. "Banking systems, mostly. Accounting programs and transfer protocols." Kurt's mind raced. Banks and a gang descended from bank robbers and counterfeiters. He wondered if there could be a connection, and then decided this was not the time to find out. All that mattered was stopping the Brevard family, whatever they were doing. He turned to Joe. "Call it in," he said. "I'm going to find Sienna." "I should go with you," Joe said. "No," Kurt said. "Stay with them. They're going to need you to lead them out when the Marines come over the wall." Chapter 51. Aboard the lead Blackhawk, codenamed Dragon 1, Lieutenant Brooks studied his men as the strike team continued inbound. Some of the men talked and joked. Some checked their weapons and gear repeatedly in some kind of ritual, and others had faces of stone. Different personalities got ready for battle in different ways, but one look told Brooks they were ready. So far, they'd come 300 miles south, met up with the tanker aircraft, and completed the tricky nighttime refueling operation without incident. From that point, they'd turned southeast and were now tracking for the coast, traveling in formation at 130 knots, a mere 50 feet above the surface of the Mozambique Channel. "We'll be crossing into Madagascar airspace in 7 minutes, the pilot informed him. "Any word from the Bataan?" "Nothing yet," the pilot said. "If we don't get final authorization by the time we hit that limit, I'll have no choice but to abort." Brooks understood. He was in charge of the mission, but those were the standing orders. "Throttle back a bit," he suggested, "and take us parallel to the line for a while." "Sir?" "It'll save us some fuel," Brooks said, "and it'll give those marine biologists a little more time to make contact." "You really think they're going to pull this off?" the pilot asked skeptically. "I'm not sure," Brooks said, "but I'd hate to be headed home if they call for help." The pilot nodded his agreement, made a quick radio call to the other helicopters, and then banked to the right and began reducing speed. The other Black Hawks matched him, and the headlong race toward the coast became a more leisurely flight parallel to it. There was little danger of them being picked up on radar. Madagascar had only a primitive network. Fuel and time were bigger concerns. "Okay, Lieutenant," the pilot said. "We've dialed it down to the economy setting, but we can't do this for too long." As it turned out, they didn't have to. 15 minutes later, a signal came over the satellite downlink. "Dragon Leader, this is Courthouse. Do you copy?" Courthouse was the Bataan's code name. Brooks pressed the transmit switch. "Courthouse, this is Dragon Leader. Go ahead." "You are cleared to the objective. Current target status is green. Friendlies have been identified. Total of 15, possibly 16. Their location will be marked by a green flare and smoke. Other buildings are believed to hold up to 20 hostiles. Light weapons are indicated." A surge of adrenaline pumped through Brooks, and he glanced at the pilot and toward the coast like a referee signaling first down. The pilot took the hint, turned inbound once again, and brought the Black Hawk back up to full speed. "Roger that, Courthouse. We are 2 minutes from Continental Divide and inbound to the target. We'll contact you on our way home." As the mission director from the Bataan signed off, Brooks considered the state of things. In a world that had grown used to watching their military operations play out in real time, this one was being blacked out. There was no feed being broadcast to the Situation Room in the White House, no group of generals and politicians watching the play-by-play as if it were a movie or a big game. With the whole government unsure which systems were still secure and which had been hacked, no one was taking a chance. The powers that be would wait in silence. Eventually, they'd receive a simple phone call from the Bataan's commander, telling them if the mission had succeeded or failed. As the Marine Strike Force turned inbound, Kurt made his way around the side of the Brevard Palace. Lights aimed up at the structure meant the last 10 feet or so would expose him no matter how the infiltration suit attempted to compensate. Instead of crossing through them, he swung wide, past an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and made his way around the back. There, he found an overhanging veranda. Using a chair to boost himself up, he clambered onto the deck and sprinted forward. He managed to force the door and slip inside. Thankful that he'd set off no alarm system in the process, he moved into the hall and found himself surrounded by framed works of art, intricate tapestries, and statues that looked as if they might belong in a museum. He needed to find a stairwell that led upward and began to move down the hall, stopping at the sound of footfalls coming his way from an adjacent corridor. He backtracked and took cover behind a statue of some Greek hero with a laurel leaf on his head and pressed himself as far into the shadows as possible until the figure passed by. It was Callista. She was speaking into a radio, giving orders about something. She never saw Kurt or even looked in his direction. As she reached the far end of the hall, she disappeared into a room. In a house of many rooms, Kurt knew he'd be hard-pressed to find the right one in time. But seeing Callista pass by brought a new idea to mind. Checking the hall in both directions and seeing no one else coming, he moved from behind the statue and backtracked. heading toward the room Callista had just entered. Chapter 52. Callista was ready to leave. Over the years, she'd begun to feel claustrophobic in the family home, a sensation that had only gotten worse over the past few months. Grabbing a small backpack from a shelf in her closet, she began to pack. Ever the pragmatist, she didn't care for the clothes or the jewels. Her items of importance were those that would be useful. Passports in several names, bundles of cash in a few different currencies, a knife, a pistol, and 3 spare magazines. The one item of sentimental value she had was a necklace with a diamond ring hanging from it that had belonged to their mother. Sebastian had given it to her. She eyed the necklace for a moment and then placed it into a side pocket and zipped the pocket shut. Nothing else in the opulent mansion mattered to her. It was all fake. The artwork, tapestries, and the antique furniture were nothing but good forgeries. That's what their family did. They gave life to lies. About the only thing she would miss were the horses. As she thought about her favorite, a horse named Tana, which meant sunshine in Malagasy, it dawned on her that Sebastian might have rigged the stables to explode like everything else in the compound. This struck her as cruel. Humankind was fairly worthless in her eyes, but animals in their innocence were something else. They had no schemes or desires other than to please their masters and receive their rewards in the form of food and shelter and attention. She zipped the bag shut and decided to hike down to the stable and turn the animals out. There was no reason for them to burn to death. Throwing the pack over one shoulder, she left the bedroom, entered her sitting room, and tracked straight for the door. As she approached the door, she noticed it was closed but not shut. That was more than odd. She never left the door unlatched. She put her hand in her bag, grabbing for her pistol. "Sorry, Callista," a voice said from behind her. "I'm afraid it's game over." She froze in her tracks. The timbre of the voice was easily recognizable, as was the calm and certain delivery of the words. She had no doubt that Kurt Austin was standing behind her. "Toss the bag on the floor and turn around slowly," he said. She let her shoulders sag and flipped the backpack into a corner. Pivoting slowly, she found Kurt sitting in a high-backed Victorian chair, aiming a lethal-looking rifle in her direction.
"I believe we've done this before,"
she said. "We have," Kurt replied, standing up. "And we're going to keep doing it until we get it right." She studied him for a moment. He looked out of place with all the armor. Less handsome, less unique. As if he'd read her mind, he pulled off the hood.
"How on earth did you get in here?"
she asked.
"We have cameras, guards, motion sensors."
"Nothing's foolproof," Kurt said. That much was certain.
"You can't expect to get out alive," she said. "We're ready for you. We've been waiting for you to make a move."
His eyebrows went up. "Really?" he said. "Because it doesn't look that way to me. Your men at the front gate are half asleep. The gang in the bunkhouse are celebrating like it's Bastille Day. And we've already found the hostages while taking out 2 of your guards. All without the slightest peep from the rest of you."
"There are at least 50 men here loyal to my brothers and me. You're overwhelmingly outnumbered."
"For now," he said smugly. She pursed her lips. So there were reinforcements coming. And coming soon. Her brother was sitting around foolishly thinking they were not in danger yet. Her feelings were torn. Silently she cursed him for his arrogance, even as she wished she could warn him.
"If you've already won, then what do you want from me?" she asked. "Answers, perhaps? Are you still trying to figure out what happened to you on the Ethernet?"
He smiled at her. It was a grin both endearing and proud. "Too late for that," he said. "I know what happened. Enough of it, anyway. It all came back once they debugged me in Korea." She shifted her weight.
"Then you know if it wasn't for me, you'd have been killed and buried at sea in the hull of that yacht, just like all the others we encountered."
"Considering that you caused the danger in the first place, that doesn't really carry a lot of weight with me. On the other hand," he added, "I do have a newfound appreciation for the importance of remembering the past accurately, thanks to you. That being the case, I thought I'd return the favor."
"What are you talking about?"
she asked, growing tired of the conversation. He studied her with those ice-blue eyes, taking her in, measuring her. Finally, he unzipped a diagonal pocket on the right side of his vest and pulled from it a folded sheet of paper. He placed it down on the small stand between the chairs, smoothed it flat, and then pulled away. "Take a look," was all he said. She hesitated and then stepped cautiously forward, reaching for the paper like someone might reach for a dangerous animal, keeping as much distance between her body and the printed sheet as possible. She tilted the page to catch the light and gave the image a quick once-over.
What is this supposed to be?
"It's a family," he said. "Believe it or not, it's your family. Your real family." She looked up at him suspiciously.
What are you talking about?
She noticed he was watching her with a sort of detached, almost professorial look. "The Brevards aren't your family, Callista. The people in the photograph are. The woman's name is Abigail. She was your mother. Her friends called her Abby. The man's name is Stuart, and he was your father. The two boys are Nathan and Zach. Or I should say they were named Nathan and Zach." For reasons she couldn't pinpoint, she began to feel sick.
You expect me to believe this?
"Look at the woman. Look at her face. You two could be twins." She wasn't blind. She saw the likeness. It was nonsense.
You think you can trick me?
He didn't blink. "It's not a trick. Your mother was a telecommunications expert. Your father worked on satellite guidance. They were both very intelligent people, brilliant in their understandings of math and science. Just like you, I'm guessing. They had a good life in suburban England. Unfortunately, the Brevard family came along, took them from the world, and made them disappear. The same way you kidnapped Sienna and her children. They were bartered for and used for what they knew, the same exact way you and Sebastian and the rest of this sick family have used the people you're holding hostage." She was shaking her head, filled with rage, a kind of rage she was having a hard time controlling. It was unlike her. She was cold, emotionless. Why should this make her so angry, she wondered. Of course he would lie. Of course he would try something to confuse her. But why, if he and his friends were all but assured of victory in their own minds, would he bother? She felt an urge to charge him, to put her hands around his throat and choke the life out of him if she could. Even if he shot her in response, at least she wouldn't have to listen to any more of this. She lunged for him.
You're a liar,
she screamed. She slammed one fist into his chest, where it uselessly struck the body armor, and reached for his face with her other hand, intent on clawing out his eyes. But he was too quick and too strong. He caught her arm and stopped it. He spun her around and folded her arms across her chest, holding her from behind. "I'm not lying," he said. "I'm not trying to hurt you. But you should know the truth."
I don't want to know.
"Believe me, you do," he said. "Because these people are better than the Brevards. These people loved life. They didn't abuse and destroy it. And you're one of them." She continued to thrash and tried to slam and elbow him, but it was no use. "I know what kind of hell it is to wonder what's real and what isn't," he said quietly. "I know what you're going through right now. I lived it for months, but you've had it worse. You've lived it all your life. I can only imagine what it's done to you."
It's done nothing,
she insisted, trying desperately to kick him and pull free. He turned her around and looked into her eyes. "Your father was killed trying to escape his captors," he said. "He was gunned down in broad daylight by a man who was never found. He'd been gagged and beaten. He'd been tortured.
Stop it.
Your mother and brothers fared worse. They'd found a lifeboat on a ship half buried in the sand, but they didn't have enough water. They died from dehydration, drifting on the ocean 100 miles from here." She froze.
What did you say?
"They died at sea," he repeated, "on a lifeboat half gutted with rot. We're pretty certain they found it on an old ship that was buried in the river several miles from here." An image flashed in her mind. It struck like a bolt of lightning. A brief glimpse of the rivets on the dark metal plating, the rushing river, the sediment being scoured away.
A ship, she whispered. An old iron ship?
A second bolt of lightning struck. It was night. There was only a sliver of moonlight to see with. A woman had her by the wrist, leading her toward the hill. Two boys were dragging a small wooden boat from a cave they'd excavated in the sand.
It's a lie,
she protested. It's the truth, he said. Your truth. She'd ceased struggling now, her mind adrift. He continued to hold her tight, perhaps because he couldn't trust her. But as her legs began to shake, she felt he was holding her up, keeping her from buckling right then and there. The memories continued to come. Men chasing them. A gunshot ripped through one of the containers. The water was spilling out. Disaster.
There's not enough water,
Callista spoke aloud. More gunshots. The woman fell.
They shot her,
Callista said to no one. She was wounded, Kurt replied softly, but it was superficial.
She fell down the hill.
In her mind, Callista heard the woman shout.
Olivia!
Callista felt only fear. Terrible, swirling fear.
Mom!
One of the boys had yelled.
Olivia, hurry!
More gunshots sounded, and the woman turned and ran. Callista just stood there on the hill, while down below, her mother and brothers pushed the small boat out into the water. She saw them climb on board and paddle into the darkness, moving swiftly with the current. She felt the men rush by her, watched as they scrambled down the bank, and listened as they fired again and again into the dark. But she never flinched. She just stood there and stared until eventually the shooting ceased, and one of the men came up to her and took her hand.
I let them go without me,
she said to Kurt. She was sobbing, dropping to the ground. Kurt eased her down gently. There wasn't enough water, he told her. Not enough for 3. Certainly not enough for 4. She was sobbing and shaking, and then suddenly angry again.
You have no right to...
The insanity of what she was saying cut her off before she'd finished. The Brevard family stole your life, he said. Maybe they realized how sharp you already were. Maybe they knew they could mold you into one of them. Maybe they planned to kill you and just never got around to it. But whatever their reasons, they stole your life. They stole the lives of your family, and we think many others. And if you let them, they'll steal the lives of Sienna and her children and everyone else they're holding in that oversized Quonset hut halfway down the hill. She noticed he kept saying Sebastian or the Brevard family, but she knew her part in it. For a second, she wanted to scream out, to yell at him, "This is who I am," to claim it and own it and tell him to go to hell. But the desire faded, and tears returned uncontrollably. Why shouldn't her name and memories be false? Everything else around her was a lie. As she cried, Kurt moved to a spot in front of her and gently wiped the tears from her face. "Help me get to Sienna before the Marines arrive," he said. "Sebastian is going to lose tonight, but I don't want him using her as a shield or killing her in a fit of spite when he realizes it's over for him." She looked up at him. There was kindness and determination in that face. The white knight, she thought. He really was.
It's not over for him,
she said. It will be soon.
No, you don't understand,
she replied.
You may be early, but he knew a response would be coming. He's got some nasty surprises waiting for your friends, and he's got a plan of escape locked and loaded.
He couldn't know we would be coming.
Not you, but he knew someone would be,
she said.
He's waiting for it. While our men are fighting with your forces, he'll blow this place to kingdom come. The hacking you're seeing now will end, and he'll disappear. We'll disappear. And the whole world will assume we're dead.
So history does repeat itself, Kurt said. We have to stop him. And we have to stop whatever he has planned. Will you help me or not?" She looked at him through the tears. "I'll trust you," he said.
Why would you?
"Call it instinct," he said, offering her a hand. She hesitated. Her true desire was to remain there on the floor, to lie there until the fires came and consumed her. A fate she'd never been more certain she deserved. "A wise man once told me, 'We are who we decide to be,'" he said. "You have a choice. You can be Callista Brevard, or you can reclaim your humanity as Olivia Bannister." The names seemed to fire something in her, but it wasn't what he might have expected. Olivia was a frightened child. Callista was unafraid. Callista was a survivor, an instrument of power. And now, she thought, an instrument of retribution. She took Kurt's hand and stood.
No,
She said,
this is who I am. I'll help you find Sienna. But don't get between me and Sebastian. Because I'm going to kill him for what he and his family have done. If you try to stop me, I'll kill you too.
"Your choice," Kurt said. "Either way, let's move. We don't have much time." Chapter 53. With Callista leading the way, the two of them strode the halls. Though Kurt had professed trust in her, he wasn't about to give her a weapon. He just needed her to get him past the goons who would be guarding the control room, or at least close enough so he could eliminate them.
This way,
She said, turning down the hallway on the right. At that moment, an alarm began to scream. Kurt held still, wondering if she'd triggered something.
It wasn't me.
She said, apparently guessing his thoughts. The sound of automatic gunfire outside the building reverberated through the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of helicopters passing overhead. The Marines had arrived, and not unnoticed. The sound of a rocket screaming through the air was followed by an explosion and a flash of light through the windows at the far end of the hall. "We need to hurry," Kurt said. He and Callista began to run. They were almost to the end when one of Sebastian's men came running the opposite way. "Callista!" he shouted. "We're being attacked! No one is answering at the pen, and—" Just then he saw Kurt and quickly guessed that he was part of the assault. He swung a submachine gun around and fired. Kurt saw it coming, pushed Callista out of the way, and dove to the polished floor. As shells ripped into the plaster behind him, he aimed the rifle and squeezed the trigger almost simultaneously. The railgun spat a swarm of lethal iron projectiles that ripped into the man, taking him off his feet and knocking him over. He landed on his back, but the muscles in his hand must have contracted in a spasm because the submachine gun continued to fire, spraying a line of bullets along the wall and up into the ceiling, shattering two of the mirrors and blasting apart a suit of armor. "So much for the element of surprise," Kurt said. He got up, helped Callista to her feet once again, and took off down the hall. At that very moment, Lieutenant Brooks and the members of the Force Recon platoon were thinking the exact same thing. They'd come in from the coast, flying along the deck, blacked out and watching for any sign they'd been detected or painted by the sweep of a radar beam. All signs pointed to a clean entry. And then they'd crossed the wall of the sprawling compound and slowed to a hover so the strike teams could begin a fast rappel to the ground. But even as the ropes went out, they'd begun to take direct fire. Not from any human targets on the ground, but from remotely operated weapons. From at least 3 spots in the garden, twin 50-caliber machine guns had risen from small maintenance sheds. They were tracking and turning and firing on the helicopters. One of the Blackhawks was already smoking and pulling away when Brooks gave the order to the rest of them. "Pull back," he shouted. "Take evasive action." The pilot turned the craft away from the fire and began to move out. But the horrible rattling sound of shells ripping through the fuselage told Brooks it was too late. Shrapnel and bits of the cabin were blasted about like confetti. Blood spattered on the wall of the fuselage as at least one man took a hit. At the same time, the helicopter lurched to the side, and Brooks saw that the pilot had also been wounded. They were spinning and going down. The co-pilot took control and tried to right the craft, but they hit the ground with a crunch. The Black Hawk rolled over on its side, forcing the enormous rotor blades into the ground and shattering them into 1,000 pieces. Go, go, go! Brooks shouted, pushing one man out through the door and then grabbing the wounded pilot and scrambling to safety. The Black Hawk's crew and the 12 Marines were clear of the helicopter when it exploded. 3 men were injured, as well as the pilot, and a mission that was supposed to be a walk in the park had suddenly turned into a desperate fight. The men took cover near a rock wall and set up a defensive perimeter. Brooks saw the other Black Hawks fleeing to safety. It looked as if they would all clear the danger zone when a missile launched from another dilapidated shed. The fiery tail of the rocket was easy to track. It raced south after the helicopter and illuminated it in a ball of flame. "Damn," Brooks cursed. "We've been set up." By now, men were streaming from the barracks, and small arms fire was whistling past overhead. Brooks grabbed the radio and called out, "Dragon leader to Dragon team, stay clear of the fire zone. I repeat, stay clear of the fire zone. Compound is more heavily defended than anticipated. Missiles and heavy caliber weapons." "Dragon 3 clear," a call came back. "Dragon 4 also clear." That meant Black Hawk 2 had taken the missile. Brooks had no way of determining if anyone had survived the explosion. Brooks pressed the talk switch. "Dragon 5, what's your position?" Dragon 5 was the spare helicopter brought in primarily to haul the hostages out, but it also carried 2 Navy medics. "We're still at Point Alpha. Do you need us?" "Negative," Brooks said. "Remain there until I contact you." "We're not going to leave you down there, Lieutenant." "You will if I order you to," Brooks replied. "Stay clear until I tell you otherwise." Putting the radio down, Brooks looked around at his men. 3 of them were injured. That left 9 plus the co-pilot, who had to do more than fly at this point. "Jones," Brooks called to one of the men, "get your squad to the south. Make sure no one flanks us." "Yes, sir." "Dalton, Garcia, you're with me. We've got to find those guns in that missile battery and take them out." "Yes, sir," the men replied in unison. Under a covering fire, the 3 men moved out, racing 50 yards to the north and then scampering up the wall onto the next terrace. As the unexpected battle raged all around the compound, Joe remained with the hostages. He could tell by the din of the explosions and the volume of gunfire that something had gone wrong. "Everyone get on the floor," he said. "Flip those tables over and pile up those mattresses." Almost on cue, gunfire ripped through the top of the building. Joe hit the deck along with everyone else. Prayers could be heard in 3 different languages. The sound of children whimpering needed no translation. "I thought we were leaving," someone asked. "So did I," Joe muttered. Wondering what had gone wrong, Joe crawled to the door and pushed it open a crack. Flames lit up the sky at the bottom of the hill. He heard the sounds of the helicopters maneuvering in the distance and the report of the heavy machine guns. Over the headset, he heard Brooks calling out that they'd been shot down and warning the others away. Across the terrace, he saw 2 separate groups of men rushing down the hill and firing wildly. Between these men and the men from the barracks, the Marines from the downed helicopter would soon be badly outnumbered. Joe knew his help was needed, but if he left the hut, the hostages would be utterly alone and defenseless. He studied the action a moment longer. It was all going on down the hill from where they were, with the sounds of another battle raging at the main house. But to his right, out to the south, all was quiet. "Time to go," he said. "Don't want to miss the bus." He began waving them up to the door, pointing to the right, where it was dark and quiet. "There's a wall about 70 yards away. Get to it, climb over it, and keep going. Don't stop until you're at least 1,000 yards from here and you've found some kind of shelter. A ditch, some bushes, a stand of those weird trees, anything that can hide you." He handed Montresor the green flare. "If you see any helicopters overhead, light this and hold it up. They'll know you're the hostages and not enemy combatants." As Montresor and the others gathered around the door, Joe took another look outside. "What about my mom?" Tanner Westgate asked. "Kurt will find her," Joe said. "You can count on that." The little faces streaked with tears clutched at Joe's heart. When each of the young children was holding hands with an adult, Joe snuck forward, made sure the path was clear, and then waved them out. He led them about halfway, and when he was certain they were clear of the firefight, he pointed toward the wall. "Go," he said, urging them forward. "Get over that wall and don't look back." As the prisoners scrambled into the darkness, Joe turned back toward the sounds of engagement. Gazing down the hill, he could see the firefight in all its nighttime iridescent glory. From the tracer fire, it was clear that Lieutenant Brooks and his men were getting shot to pieces from 3 sides as 30 or 40 of Brevard's men slowly closed in around them. Joe began to move forward. "Unbelievable," he whispered. "All this time I've been waiting to call in the cavalry, and it turns out I am the cavalry." With that thought in mind, he pressed forward, unsure of what, if anything, he might achieve. Chapter 54. As the chaos outside grew, Kurt and Callista found themselves in a running battle with the rest of Brevard's men. They'd made it down one hall, with Kurt laying down a suppressing fire to keep those behind them at bay, only to run smack into a second group coming the other way. Now, halfway to the control room, they were caught in crossfire, with shots coming at them from both ends of the hall. "Get behind me," Kurt said to Callista as he returned fire.
"You should have given me a gun,"
she said. "I had my reasons," Kurt said.
"How do those reasons sound now?"
"Not as good as they did back then," he admitted. With little cover beyond an old wooden credenza, Kurt had to keep up a steady rate of fire to keep their enemies back. A blue digital counter on the top of the gun told him the status of his ammo. It hit 0 rather quickly, and he changed clips. Realizing they had to get out of this battle before he used up the second clip, he began shooting out the lights one by one until the central section of the hall was bathed in shadows. In response, their attackers hit the main switch and doused the rest of the hall in darkness, which only helped his plan. Kurt retreated along the wall, found a door, and kicked it open. "Get inside," he said. Callista did as ordered, as more bullets skipped off the marble floor. Hoping to trick the two groups into shooting each other, Kurt fired a half-dozen shots along one length of the hall and then loosed a few more back the other way. As soon as he'd finished, he stepped backward and shut the door. As it closed, he heard volleys being fired from both sides. For a little while, at least, they would have trouble distinguishing between their own shots and Kurt's. But he knew all he'd done was buy him and Callista some time. As Kurt plotted their next move, Callista was busy shoving a large couch up against the door and wedging the arm under the handle. "Not a bad idea," he said.
"How long do you think we have?"
she asked, pulling a dresser against the couch. "They'll figure out pretty quickly that I'm no longer firing at them," he said, "but it'll take a minute or two before they get up the courage to rush down the hall."
"And then what?"
Before Kurt could answer, the scream of a rocket sounded outside the building. As Kurt turned, he saw the white flare of another missile ripping its way into the night.
"Sebastian,"
Callista said.
"Always another trick up his sleeve. Those are Acosta's. He was the arms dealer."
Kurt made a quick but grim assessment. "We have to stop this, or none of us will leave here alive."
"We have to get to the control room," she said. "It's all operated from there."
They would never make it by charging down the hall, not even with the railgun blazing and the Kevlar armor to protect the most vital parts of Kurt's body. There had to be another way. "What else is on this floor?" he asked.
"Nothing," she said. "Just more rooms like this. As if we were going to hold court someday."
An idea came to him. "It just might work," he said to himself. He moved up to the wall, felt along it, and then began to punch holes in the plasterboard with his fist. It was fairly standard, a wooden drywall construction. He found the studs, and then stepped back and with measured precision pointed the railgun at a section of wall, blasting a vertical line of 8 shots from top to bottom.
"What are you doing?"
she asked. "I prefer to stay in adjoining rooms," he said. With a run of several steps, he crashed into the perforated section of the wall, smashing through it with his shoulder and plowing into the space next door. Callista followed, and in quick succession, they had done the same to the next 3 rooms. Had he been using a standard rifle, Kurt might have expected the teams of men outside to hear him, but the railgun made no sound. The only noise was the projectiles flying through the plaster, a sound that reminded Kurt of an overzealous librarian energetically using a 3-hole punch.
"This is the last room,"
Callista said. Kurt checked the railgun. The counter on the top told him he had 10 shells left. 10 shells. Just in case, he unzipped the diagonal pocket across his chest that held the old Colt revolver. Hoping there would be no more resistance, he moved to the door, pulled it open a crack, and looked back down the hall. Their enemies had converged on the door to the room he and Callista had entered and were trying to break it down. "Get ready," he said. As the men down the hall blasted their way through the barricade she'd built and forced their way into the room, Kurt pulled his own door wide and dashed quietly across the hall and onto the stairwell. Callista was right behind him.
2 levels up,
she said. Kurt raced up the flight, moving so quickly that he was skipping stairs. As he neared the final turn, a trio of men came rushing down in the other direction. Kurt had no choice. He pulled the trigger. The iron shells went right through the first man and into the second, cutting them both down. They fell backward, knocking the third man to the floor, who opened fire with his Uzi submachine gun. Several shells hit Kurt's chest plate, knocking him backward. He was fairly certain that at least one shell hit Callista, because she screamed and tumbled down the stairs. Lying on his back, Kurt hit the lower trigger and sent the prongs of the taser blasting into the man's neck. He snapped into a prone position as the electricity surged through his body and he began to shake. Kurt held the trigger and kept the electricity flowing as he got to his feet, ran forward, and kicked the man in the face like he was trying to punt a football out of the stadium. The man's head snapped back, and he lay still. With the situation in hand, Kurt grabbed the Uzi and dropped back to where Callista had fallen. "You've been hit,"
my leg.
she said. Kurt pulled her up onto the landing. She'd taken a bullet to the thigh. It was bleeding, but not enough to suggest it had hit an artery. He took off her belt and wrapped it around her leg as a tourniquet.
I think it's broken,
she said. She tried to stand, but even with his help, she couldn't put any weight on it.
Just go, she said. They'll be coming up here soon enough. You'll need me to watch your back.
Kurt hesitated and then handed her the Uzi. He figured she'd earned it at this point.
Don't let him live, she said. He has no right.
Without answering, Kurt propped her up against the wall, where she'd have some cover and a good angle to fire at anyone who came her way. "Don't go anywhere," he said. "I'll be back for you."
That's what they all say,
she replied. He turned and raced up the stairs, finally arriving at the upper landing. A solid steel door blocked him. It was bolted shut. Kurt checked his ammo. 7 shells left. He hoped it would be enough. Stepping back, he opened fire on the lock. The iron projectiles tore it apart like armor-piercing rounds. The door burst open under the onslaught, and Kurt rushed in. He saw 2 guards, took one of them out, and then dove for cover as the other one started firing. Scrambling across the floor as the man unleashed a hail of shells, Kurt rolled and fired back. The lethal shot blasted through one of Sebastian's computers and killed the last of Sebastian's bodyguards instantly. Kurt stood and looked for Sienna. He spotted her at the back of the room. Sebastian had her up against his body and was holding a nickel-plated automatic to her temple.
End of CD 11. CD 12.
Chapter 55. From where he stood, Joe had the advantage of elevation and could both see and hear the battle raging on the compound's bottom 2 terraces. Over the headset, he heard Lieutenant Brooks directing his men, probing for a weakness and being pushed back. Across the dark lawns, he could see the burning helicopter and red streams of tracer fire converging on the area around it from 3 directions. He pressed the talk switch on his headset. "Dragon Leader, this is Zavala," he said. "You're being surrounded. Suggest you abandon position and move down the hill." Pressed up against the rock wall for cover, Lieutenant Brooks heard the call and sat dumbfounded for a second. None of his men were named Zavala. Then it dawned on him. One of the oceanographers went by that name. "Zavala, we cannot pull back. We have 5 men wounded, 2 critical. There's no cover lower down. If we don't hold this wall, we're dead." A burst of static gave way to the smooth-sounding voice of the oceanographer. "I'll swing around and try to relieve the pressure on your right flank." That would certainly help, but there were too many of Brevard's men there for one man to take on, even if he took them by surprise. "Negative," Brooks said. "You'll be facing 20 hostiles. If you really want to help, take out those 50-caliber guns in that missile site. Our only chance is to get the rest of the men on the ground, but they can't get within a mile of us as long as those things are active." A delay that seemed like forever made Brooks fear Zavala had been taken out. but then his voice came through loud and clear. "I'll see what I can do." Brooks fired over the top of the wall and ducked as some incoming shells blasted chunks out of the top of it. Lance Corporal William Dalton scrambled over and reinforced the position. "What's the word, Lieutenant?" "Help might be on the way," Brooks replied, "though we're never going to live it down if we get saved by a marine biologist." "At least the word marine is in the title," Dalton replied. "Good point," Brooks said, snapping off a shot and ducking once again. "Good point." Moving in a crouch, Joe made his way toward what he assumed was the missile site. But he came across the twin .50 caliber machine guns first. He saw them track left to right, as if looking for the helicopters in the distance. Putting the railgun to his shoulder, he blasted apart the pivoting tripod mechanism they were mounted on. Hydraulic fluids spewed everywhere, and the guns froze in place. "150 caliber weapon down," he said. "Good," Lieutenant Brooks replied. "See if you can get that missile launcher." "I can't see it," Joe said. "Higher up," Brooks said. "My guess would be the center of that hedge maze." Joe looked around. He could see the wall of hedges, but he had no way to reach the entrance. And considering the complexity of the maze, he doubted he could make it quickly to the center. The rattling sound of the second .50 caliber weapon got Joe's attention, and he had another idea. Zeroing in on the sound, he cut through an ornamental garden filled with strange flowering bushes. On the far side, he saw the second machine gun emplacement. He raced toward it, but instead of tracking one of the helicopters in the distant sky, the guns whirled around toward him, and the barrels began to depress. Joe figured he'd run out of coolant and was now giving off a heat signature, but he was committed and continued his charge, diving at the base of the tripod and sliding into it as the guns began hammering away, tearing up the ground behind him. With Joe clinging to the base of the tripod, the clamoring stopped, but the guns continued swinging from side to side, hopelessly trying to find a position from which to fire at him. It was no use. Joe was in too close and safely beneath their maximum angle of depression. With a nod to whoever designed the system, Joe considered his options. Instead of destroying the mechanism that aimed and fired the guns, he began taking it apart. Both machine guns began hammering away, tearing up the ground behind Joe, but he was beneath their maximum angle of depression. He crawled forward and made it to the tripod. Instead of destroying the mechanism that spun and aimed the weapons, he eased up next to it and began ripping out wires. Eventually, the weapons stopped rotating. Pulling the railgun down, Joe pulled out his knife and began stripping the wires. Soon enough, he had a half-dozen wires stripped to the copper. "Zavala?" the radio cackled. "I'm working on it," Joe said. "Whatever you're going to do, you better make it quick." Trying out different combinations of wires by pressing them together, Joe got the platform to turn in a herky-jerky motion until it was pointed back up at the center of the hedge maze. Next, he managed to elevate the guns. Now he just needed them to fire. He looked toward the trigger assembly. The weapons themselves were standard M2 .50 caliber machine guns, nothing exotic, but the triggers were covered by a metal housing. Using the back of the railgun as a club, Joe broke the housing free and got access to the triggers. A simple hydraulic clamp had been set up to pull the triggers remotely. Joe didn't have time to fiddle with that, so he put his hands around the trigger mechanism and squeezed. Both weapons began to spit lead. Every fourth shell was a tracer, and from those Joe could see his aim was a little high. He forced the barrels down a fraction and began to fire again. This time, the shells found the mark, tearing into the missile battery and shredding it. One missile exploded, another launched and flew outward before quickly nosing over and thudding into the pasture land beyond the walls. Joe was still firing when he heard Brooks calling the other helicopters. "This is Dragon Leader. The LZ is clear. Repeat, the LZ is clear." "Dragon 3 inbound," came the first call. "Dragon 4 inbound." With help on the way, Joe dropped back to the ground, picked up the railgun, and waited for the Marines to arrive. Chapter 56. In the control room on the top floor of the main house, a standoff ensued. Kurt had raised the deadly railgun and zeroed in on Sebastian Brevard's head. But Sebastian had pulled himself behind Sienna and cocked the hammer on the shiny automatic that was pressed against her temple. Considering the accuracy of his weapon, Kurt was certain he could kill Sebastian with a single shot. But the nerves of the body have strange ways of reacting to the death of the mind. If Kurt shot him, Sebastian might go limp instantaneously, or his hand might just as easily twitch, pulling the hair trigger of the pistol and killing Sienna. The fact that Kurt had only one shell left in the railgun was also a concern.
"Kurt," Sienna cried, "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault."
He looked Sienna in the eye, willing her to be calm. "It's going to be all right," he promised. "He's going to let you go." "Am I?" Sebastian said, "so that you can kill me? I don't think so." "I'm not interested in killing you," Kurt insisted. "There are plenty of others lined up for that task. If Acosta doesn't get you, the North Koreans will, or even Tan Rong, if he ever gets out of prison. Dead or alive, you're irrelevant to me at this point. Your plans are ruined. Whatever scheme you've been hatching here is going up in flames as we speak." "Is that so?" Sebastian replied, his eyebrows arched in an exaggerated look of surprise. "Because, aside from your early arrival, things are going exactly as I've intended." Kurt stared, not interested in a banal conversation with the man, but he was willing to have one if it led Sebastian to make a mistake. "You expect me to believe this is all part of some master plan?" "Come now," Sebastian continued. "Surely you've realized that we could have killed you on Westgate's yacht. The discovery of the bodies on the wreck should have told you that. Have you even asked yourself why you were spared?" Kurt had been considering that question for a while. "You were trying to keep the kidnapping a secret," he said. "You wanted me to tell the world that Sienna drowned. That way there would be no investigation." "Then why did we send you pictures of Sienna in Iran?" Sebastian asked. "Why lead you to the realization that she was alive after all?" Kurt couldn't guess. In fact, he didn't believe a word of it. But he was running out of time. The battle outside appeared to be going badly, and the sound of gunfire on the landing told him Callista was trying to hold the line. "Cat got your tongue?" Sebastian asked. "Then I'll tell you. We needed you to get the ball rolling, to begin the process of re-evaluation among your smug leaders, to plant the seed of doubt." "It doesn't matter what you had in mind," Kurt said. "It's over. You may have been ahead of us at the start, but we've been on to you since Korea. Our people are shutting down the vulnerable networks at this very moment. When the world opens up for business in the morning, Phalanx will be gone. It's being ripped out of every system it was ever installed on." A broad smile crept over Sebastian's face. There was no falsity to it. Nor did he appear to be smiling in the face of defeat. Indeed, it looked to Kurt as if he'd just delivered Sebastian some glorious news. "Of course they are," Sebastian said, "which is exactly what I've been waiting for." "You're lying," Kurt said. "Am I?" Sebastian replied. "Ask your lovely friend here if Phalanx has been compromised." Kurt refused to play along, so Sebastian turned his attention to Sienna. "Tell him."
"He's telling the truth," she said. "It's still secure. Because of the way its artificial intelligence protocols work, Phalanx can't be hacked. Not even by me."
Kurt narrowed his gaze. Tears were streaming down Sienna's face. "Then why go through all this?" Sebastian answered. "Because I've spent 3 years perfecting the greatest criminal act of all time," he boasted, "and this sudden appearance of Phalanx nearly ruined it for me. Now, thanks to you, the Westgates, and an abundance of caution, your leaders are removing it for me." Kurt saw it now. "And replacing it with the old systems," he said. "Systems you already know how to hack." Sebastian looked like a man who thought himself a genius, or even a god. His machines and his men were winning the battle outside, and the best minds in the security business had delivered to him the one thing he couldn't get for himself. They'd taken down the impenetrable wall of Phalanx and replaced it with what must have been a veritable tunnel that led right to whatever he was after. You're going to rob the world's banks, Kurt said, remembering what Montresor had worked on.
Nothing so crass as theft, Sebastian replied. I'm an artist. My crime will have much more style.
What crime? Kurt demanded. What are you after?
It's the Fed, Sienna cried out. He's planted viruses in the Federal Reserve banks.
Shut up! Sebastian shouted as he tried to keep her from talking by compressing her windpipe with his forearm. The act caused Kurt to move and almost fire, but Sebastian moved as well, effectively keeping her between them. The Fed? Kurt repeated. You can't rob the Fed. That's even more foolish than robbing a regular bank.
If I was going to burglarize it, Sebastian replied, his words laced with pride and venom. Kurt decided to prod him. Maybe, just maybe, Sebastian's ego was like those of many criminals, secretly eager for the world to know how brilliant they were. Certainly he wouldn't be the first to boast about and claim his crime.
If you're not going to rob the Fed, then what are you after? I assume you're not going to make a deposit.
Actually, Sebastian said, in a way I am.
Kurt held silent.
Do you have any idea how the Fed creates money? Sebastian asked.
Printing press, Kurt said, thinking of the Brevard's family history.
To a minor extent, Sebastian acknowledged. But they have more efficient ways, the most useful of which is the redemption of bonds. When they decide that investors or bondholders deserve to be repaid, they simply go to a computer, type in some numbers, and dollars magically appear in the bondholders' accounts as their notes are cancelled.
Sebastian grinned.
I'm not going to rob the Fed, he insisted. I'm going to use their own programs to create a series of bonds out of thin air and simultaneously create dollars to satisfy the redemption of those bonds. There will be no money missing, no losses to explain or trace. The balance sheet of the Fed will stand exactly as it does now, one side equaling the other, liabilities equaling reserves. We're not stealing money. We're creating it.
Of course, Kurt said. It made sense. You're a counterfeiter, like your ancestors, just slightly more modern.
So you know about them?
The Clar River Gang, Kurt said.
Sebastian reacted to the name, but not with shame. He seemed almost proud to admit it. My great-grandfather was a brilliant man, he said. The notes he created were perfect. They couldn't be differentiated from the real thing. Not until time affected the dies. So he had to disappear. And he did. Even with the world looking for him, he disappeared without a trace.
By murdering over 200 people on the Waratah? Kurt replied. You're not artists. You're thugs and killers.
I see you've put the puzzle together, Sebastian acknowledged, as if he were complimenting Kurt. All the more reason for me to leave.
You can't honestly think you're going to pull this off, Kurt said. There are checks and balances in the system, auditors and watchdogs.
Sebastian dragged Sienna up a step. Are you that naive? There are literally billions of transactions every day. Trillions of dollars change hands in a month's time. Do you think it's all tallied up by hordes of accountants with green visors above their eyes, toiling away in the government's back office somewhere? Computer programs do those checks and audits you spoke of. And guess who controls those programs now? I do. The data they spit out will satisfy the few humans that even bother to look past the top and bottom lines. I can assure you of that.
Sebastian dragged Sienna up another step. You can't know that for certain, Kurt said.
I'm fairly confident at this point, Sebastian said. And should your government eventually catch on, they will find that hundreds of billions of dollars have been created and disbursed to thousands of companies and straw men of my creation. They'll discover half the trail evaporates, and the other half leads to political election funds in America and other spots around the world. They'll find billions have been routed through China, Iran, North Korea. And they'll be faced with a terrible dilemma. Admit the truth and shake the world's confidence in the mighty dollar, In all likelihood, crashing the international financial system. Or let it go. Fix the hole in the wall quietly and chalk it up to experience.
Kurt had to admit that Sebastian was probably right. They might not announce it to the world, but they will hunt you down.
They will think I'm dead,
Sebastian said, dragging Sienna up the final step and pulling her toward an alcove in the far reaches of the room. Kurt could see another steel security door hinged to the alcove wall. He could not allow Sebastian to drag Sienna through it. His posture stiffened. "Take another step and I'll kill you," he said, "regardless of what else happens." Sebastian studied Kurt from behind Sienna. By now, he'd tucked in so close that only his right eye could see past her to Kurt in his menacing glare. And yet, even with that limited view, he had no doubt that Austin would fire. He'd lost this woman too many times already. He seemed unwilling to lose her again. It left Sebastian only one choice. With Sienna held tight against him, he reached across her body and pulled a tiny remote unit from his pocket. To Kurt, it looked a lot like the one Callista had used in the tunnel beneath the DMZ. "If you're planning on zapping me, you're a little late. I've been deloused."
"It's not for you," Sebastian said. "It's for her."
With that, Sebastian whispered to Sienna,
"I'll make you a deal. The same deal I've been making you all along. Your life or the lives of your children. Which will it be?"
He pressed a key on the glass-like screen of the remote, and a fireball erupted in the center of the courtyard. It was so immense it shattered the windows behind Kurt and blasted splinters of glass across the room. Kurt stood his ground as the shards pelted him.
"That was the armory,"
Sebastian gloated to Sienna.
"If you resist any further, or if he tries to stop me, I will obliterate the prisoners in their quarters and your children will burn."
A blind play, if ever there was one, Kurt thought. Neither one of them knew if the prisoners were in the hut. It was entirely possible that they were staying put and taking cover there, as the battle raged outside. It was also possible that Joe had led them away.
"Let me go,"
Sienna cried to Kurt, her eyes filled with tears. "He'll kill you," Kurt replied. "He'll kill him either way."
"Please,"
she begged. At that moment, a figure crawled through the main door. A pitiful figure, slithering on the ground.
"Brother,"
it cried out.
"Dear brother."
Callista's appearance was just enough of a surprise to distract Sebastian. He began to glance her way before catching himself. The pistol in his hand came away from Sienna's head for an instant, and in the blink of an eye, Kurt squeezed the trigger and fired. The iron projectile from the railgun hit the nickel-plated handgun at a speed of 200 feet per second, impacting it just ahead of the breech. The blow shattered the pistol as its hammer fell and struck the bullet in the chamber. The gunpowder in the 9mm cartridge ignited, and the lead shell began its journey forward. But the frame of the pistol had been mangled by Kurt's shot, and instead of being exhausted out through the mouth of the barrel, the bullet blew the weapon apart. At the moment of the explosion, it was already out of Sebastian's hand, having been torn free and hurled halfway to the rear of the alcove. The impact broke Sebastian's wrist, and shrapnel from the exploding gun flew in all directions, cutting his face and neck like claws of some enraged animal. In a blind fury, Sebastian flung Sienna toward Kurt, grabbed the door, and tried to swing it shut. Kurt was already tossing the railgun aside and reaching into the open pocket of his armored vest for the Colt. He pushed Sienna out of the way and drew the revolver like a gunfighter in the Old West, extending it toward Sebastian, cocking the hammer, and pulling the trigger in one swift motion. The booming report of the old .45 caliber shell echoed across the room as fire erupted from the barrel and a cloud of smoke burst from either side of the cylinder. The heavy shell grazed the slamming steel door and caught Sebastian just to the right of his center of mass. He was thrown backward as if he'd been kicked by a horse. He slammed against the back of the alcove and fell on his side as the door banged shut, cutting him off from Kurt's view. Kurt rushed forward and tried the handle. The door had latched, but wasn't locked. He swung it open, ready to fire again, but realized instantly that he didn't need to. Sebastian lay dead against the wall. The remote dropped from Sebastian's grasp, and Kurt relaxed for an instant, only to see on the small screen what looked like a second hand sweeping in a red arc toward the 12 o'clock position. "Run!" Kurt shouted, dashing to Sienna's side and pulling her up to her feet. The explosions began in the distance. First the prisoners' quarters, then the barracks, and then the 2 helicopters in the hangar. Kurt had helped Sienna up, and now did the same for Callista. He turned for the door, but it was too late. A series of explosions shook the main house, blasting one section after another and heading toward them like a rumbling freight train. Realizing there was no other way out, Kurt shoved Sienna toward the shattered windows and the veranda beyond. "Jump!" he shouted. Sienna leapt without question, and Kurt propelled himself and Callista over the ledge half a second later. As he fell through the air, he felt the explosions closing in. Sections of the mansion to their right and left were blown apart simultaneously. The control room followed an instant later, erupting in a fiery detonation just as Kurt, Sienna, and Callista crashed into the deep end of Sebastian's Olympic-sized swimming pool. Kurt felt his legs crunch into the bottom of the 12-foot-deep pool and looked up. Seen through the kaleidoscopic lens of the swirling water, the distorted tongues of flame were almost beautiful. A hailstorm of debris followed, including splatterings of napalm that burned on the surface of the water, and chunks of the stone from the house that crashed down around them like meteors. Kurt grabbed Sienna to prevent her from surfacing as a second wave of fire streaked above them and retreated. He could have remained down there for another minute or so, but Callista was struggling to pull free. He doubted she'd been ready for the dive. He gripped her tight and pushed off the bottom, angling away from the house and breaking the surface as the last smattering of fragments dropped from the heavens. Treading water and helping Callista keep her head above the surface, Kurt turned in a slow circle and saw that half the world was on fire. The top floors of the mansion had been blown off, while the lower floors were consumed in flames. Waves of heat assaulted him, tempered only by the coolness of the water. "That way," Kurt said, pointing toward the far end of the pool. Sienna began to swim, and Kurt rolled over onto his back, dragging Callista in a rescue swimmer's stroke. When it became shallow enough to put his feet down, he did, and from there they waded to the wall. As they climbed out, Kurt heard the sound of people approaching. He cocked the old pistol and readied himself for one more fight. But a friendly shout stopped him from firing. "Easy there, cowboy," Joe Zavala said as he emerged from the dark. As Kurt lowered the pistol, several Marines came into view, moving in behind Joe. "Kurt, this is Lieutenant Brooks," Joe said. "Lieutenant Brooks, I present Kurt Austin." Brooks flashed a grin at Kurt and then seemed to recognize Callista. He raised his weapon. "It's okay," Kurt said, holding out a hand. "But she's one of them," Brooks insisted. "No," Kurt said. "As it turns out, she's not one of them after all." Brooks made a quick decision. He lowered his weapon and clicked his radio. "Get the Sark up here," he said, referring to the Navy medic, 2 of whom had landed in Dragon 5. "We've got another wounded player." Even before the medic arrived, Brooks dropped down beside Callista and began working on her wounds.
"What about my children?" Sienna asked. "And the others?"
"Safe and sound," Joe said. "I sent them for ice cream as soon as the battle got underway." Brooks chimed in. "They made it over the wall and met up with a couple of the guys from Dragon 3.
"Where are they now?"
Dragon 4 swooped in and picked them up," Brooks said. "They're already on their way back to the baton." Hearing that, Sienna's whole posture softened in a wave of relief. Her chest heaved, and she began to cry again. But this time, they were tears of joy. Kurt smiled. "So, I'm guessing we won." "We did," Joe said. "While you were taking a midnight dip with 2 beautiful women, the rest of us were working hard to turn the tide of battle." "Glad to hear it," Kurt said. "And how are the rest of us going to get out of here? We seem to be a little short on helicopters." "Dragon 3 will max out and take the wounded," Brooks said. "The rest of us will head for the coast. Madagascar has a pretty limited military, and we seem to be miles from anywhere important, but I don't want to run into any well-meaning members of the neighborhood watch." Kurt nodded. "Are we walking?" "No," Brooks said. "My men have rescued a bunch of horses from the stables on the lower terrace. We'll be riding." At that, Callista looked up.
"I'll ride,"
she said. Brooks shook his head. "You're in no shape to ride, ma'am. You'll go on the helicopter." She stiffened her back and pulled free from his grasp.
"I said I'll ride. Besides, you'll need someone to show you the way."
"I think we can find the ocean on our own," Brooks insisted. "Trust me," Kurt said. "There's no point arguing with her." Brooks shrugged. "Suit yourself." A few minutes later, the group arrived at the stables. The last of the Blackhawks sat in the pasture close by. Sienna hugged Kurt tightly.
"I owe you everything,"
she whispered in his ear.
"My life, my family. How can I ever repay you?"
"Just go live," Kurt said. "And tell your husband I'm sorry for slugging him in the jaw." She gazed at him with a look of confusion. "Long story," he said. "Knowing what he's been through, I'm hoping he won't even remember it." She nodded, began to cry again, and smiled through the tears. She hugged him tightly once more, and then went aboard the helicopter. As the helicopter powered up and lifted off, Kurt found his way into the stables. Callista was already on her horse, and the others were mounting up. Kurt climbed on a sturdy-looking animal and took the reins. "Look at me," Joe said. "I really am the cavalry. Now I'm even riding a horse." Only Kurt laughed. No one else got the joke. They rode from the stables single file, traveled down the main path and out onto the open plain with the Brevard Palace and Sebastian's mad dreams burning to ashes on the hill behind them. Kurt noticed that Callista never looked back. Instead, she led them to a path she'd worn into the soil over the years. Only now did she realize why she'd always returned to that strange hill where the ship had been buried. Only now did she remember her real brothers talking about a lifeboat. And then Sebastian as a young man with Egan and Laurent, working down there to cover what her mother and brothers had excavated. 2 hours later, they came out onto the shore, where a wide beach met slow-rolling surf. There, Lieutenant Brooks ordered the group to a halt, made a radio call, and lit a low-light beacon. After a short wait, a pair of high-speed collapsible boats came racing in from the dark, manned by crews of 2 in camouflage and face paint. They entered the shallows and coasted to a stop just the other side of the low breakers. "Someone call for a water taxi?" one of the camouflaged men asked. With the Marines watching the shore in both directions, Kurt helped Callista down from her horse. She was pale and cold. She rubbed the blaze on the horse's nose and whispered something about running free. The horse took off, galloping down the shore, and Callista all but collapsed. Kurt picked her up, cradling her in his arms and carrying her into the surf as she wrapped her hands around his neck and held on.
"I should have left here 27 years ago,"
she whispered. "Better late than never," Kurt said. He carried her to the nearest boat and lowered her gently into it. He climbed in after her, and Joe followed suit, as the Marines took spots in the second boat. Moments later, they were cutting through the surf and racing out to sea. Only Callista was surprised when a great black shape rose up through the water and allowed the boats to slide up onto its back. A group of sailors helped them out of the boats and directed them to a deck hatch. Callista was taken to the infirmary while the ship's commander shook hands with Kurt and Joe. "Welcome aboard the USS Ohio," he said. "I hear you guys work for Dirk Pitt at Jim Sandecker's old outfit, Numa." They nodded in unison. "Both men asked me to give you their regards," the commander said. "Plan on briefing them tomorrow morning, which is an hour and 40 minutes, by the way." "Just our luck," Kurt said. "At least you spent 3 days snoozing in Korea," Joe said. "Imagine how I feel." Kurt laughed. "I'll do the briefing," he said, "but I need to get a secure message through before we submerge. Would that be possible?" "Sure," the commander replied. "What do you want it to say?" "It's complicated," Kurt began. "Basically, I need someone to declare a bank holiday tomorrow, and maybe for the rest of the week. Just in case." Chapter 57. In the last hours of that night, the SS Waratah finally returned home. Some had wanted to delay her arrival until morning, but Paul would have none of it. He thought the venerable old ship had been away long enough. Nudged forward by the Sedgwick, she came into the harbor virtually alone. But as she approached the dock, Paul noticed a sight he would remember for the rest of his life. It seemed as if half of Durban had come out, and thousands stood quietly in the dark with candles in their hands. They lined both sides of the inlet and the dock. He saw no camera flashes, and there were no dignitaries waiting to give speeches. All that would come later. For tonight, the people of South Africa were welcoming this ship home. The Waratah bumped the dock and was tied up. A high-ranking officer of the South African Navy came aboard, and Paul relinquished command of the ship. From that moment on, he thought only of finding Gamay and wrapping his arms around her. True to her word, she was waiting for him at the bottom of the gangway. They embraced and began walking the dock. Paul had never in his life seen so many cards, flowers, and wreaths. He stopped beside a picture that looked familiar to him. In the black-and-white portrait, he saw a burly man with a handlebar mustache. His name was written below, as was his position, fireman on board the Waratah, assigned to the aft boiler. Paul still didn't believe in ghosts, but he wondered if they might exist after all. Hand in hand, he and Gamay walked the rest of the dock without saying a single word. Chapter 58. The details of Kurt's message explained what he knew about Brevard's scheme, and when the president and the chairman of the Fed were informed, a 3-day moratorium on all Fed activity was declared. Meanwhile, Montresor, Sienna Westgate, and the other hackers willingly explained what they'd done and been forced to do, revealing the virus's blinds and trapdoors they'd planted one by one, until all the various dangers were uncovered and neutralized. After 12 hours on board the Ohio, Kurt, Joe, and Callista were transferred to a ship bound for Durban. At the same time, Lieutenant Brooks and the other Marines were picked up and flown back to the Bataan, after promising never to make fun of oceanographers again. Upon their approach into the Durban harbor, Kurt and Joe marveled at the sight of the Waratah, back home after all these years. Untold thousands of bouquets lined the dock in front of her, and a proper cleaning and restoration was already underway. Plans were being made to turn part of the ship into a museum and the rest into a floating memorial to the 211 passengers and crew who vanished over a century ago. A journal discovered in the sickbay gave some closure to the mystery, though sadly the descendants had to live with the knowledge that those who weren't killed in the original hijacking were abandoned in lifeboats to perish at sea in the subsequent storm. A memorial service with full honors was being planned. As they bumped the dock, Kurt looked around for friendly faces. "I thought Paul and Gamay were going to be here," he mentioned to Joe. "I got a message from them," Joe said. "They're on a double date with Duke and Elena. Something about going to a shooting gallery to prove once and for all who saved the Waratah?" Kurt shrugged. The message made no sense to him. Though Paul and Gamay weren't there to greet them, someone else was. An attractive woman in a white dress that contrasted nicely with her cinnamon-colored tan. She stood on the pier below, waving and shouting up to Joe. "Didn't know you had friends in these parts," Kurt said, though Joe seemed to have a friend in every port. "She's the reporter who did the story on how I rescued you from the maw of the angry sea," Joe explained. "We hit it off while you were recuperating." "Well, if anyone's earned some R&R around here, it's you. See you back in D.C. Joe nodded, sauntered down the gangway, and left with the young woman. As others made their way off the ship, Kurt turned to Callista. She'd begun to recover from her injuries, but looked more drawn than ever.
What's going to happen to me?
She asked.
Am I going to prison?
Kurt took a deep breath. A lot of people have questions for you, he admitted. The FBI, Interpol, Scotland Yard. But there are significant extenuating circumstances in your case. Beyond that, you helped us when it counted, and you've already provided useful information about the other conspirators. She perked up a little bit and looked down at her legs. A cast covered the lower half of her left leg, while a tracking bracelet on her right ankle reminded her that she wasn't free. The South African police and the British consulate intended to keep track of her until they decided her fate. She'd been told someone would be with her at all times, and indeed a member of the Durban police force was waiting at the bottom of the gangway. It certainly didn't look like she was going to have a lot of freedom anytime soon. She turned back to Kurt.
Will you come visit me in the clink? I'm sure I'll be in solitary most of the time.
He laughed. Absolutely, he promised. I'll bring you a cake with a file in it. She raised an eyebrow. It's the least I could do, he added. As far as I'm concerned, you're part of the pack now. She looked at him strangely.
Part of the pack?
He didn't bother trying to explain. When you get some downtime, read Kipling's The Jungle Book. It'll make more sense after that. She nodded and turned back to the pier, watching as a group of people filed out through the doors of the passenger embarkation building and stood together waiting. The group seemed to be 3 generations. A couple with gray hair, 3 people in their 30s or 40s, and several children.
I don't know if I can do this,
she said. These people are your family, Kurt said. Your real family. They've flown all the way from England to meet you.
What are they going to think of me?
She asked.
What am I going to tell them? I've done terrible things.
They're going to see you as the prodigal daughter, Kurt said. They're going to find in you the reward for the hope they kept alive all these years. They're going to tell you stories about your mother and father. To be honest, if it's anything like my family reunions, you'll be lucky to get a word in edgewise. She appreciated what he was saying, but the fear was overwhelming.
I can't,
she said, shaking her head. Callista can't, Kurt replied, but Olivia can. Remember how you set your horse free? Set Callista free, too. It's time to let her go. She took a deep breath, obviously trying to steel herself against the waves of emotion. She turned toward him and changed the subject.
You really should have kissed me,
she said,
back on Acosta's yacht. It would have saved us a whole lot of trouble.
Kurt laughed deeply, and a smile came to his face, giving him dimples and wrinkling the sun-kissed skin around his eyes. I highly doubt a kiss from me is going to change anyone's life.
Would have been nice to find out,
she said. He continued to smile and then slowly leaned toward her. Sliding his hand across her cheek and cupping her face, he pulled her gently toward him, and their lips met softly in a lingering kiss. When they parted, she was smiling broadly.
I don't know,
she said.
That was pretty good.
Kurt laughed again. Go see your family, he said. They've been waiting for 30 years. She nodded, looked at him one last time, and then was helped down the gangway by a ship's officer. The constable from the Durban police force met them and led her toward the family she'd never known. 26 hours later, Kurt was passing through customs in the main terminal at Washington's Dulles International Airport. He'd lost all track of time, but it was dark outside. And considering how deserted the terminal was, it had to be late at night or very early in the morning. In fact, the only people he saw were members of the cleaning crew. Kurt moved slowly toward baggage claim, pausing when he saw a gathering of airport police near one of the security doors. Outside on the tarmac, several vehicles with flashing red and blue lights were parked in a circle around a private jet that sat with its door open and its stairs down. Curiosity gave way to surprise when he recognized David Forrester being escorted into the terminal by two agents in windbreakers with FBI written on the backs. "Well, I'll be damned," Kurt said. At the sound of Kurt's voice, the agents and the prisoner looked up. "Excuse me, sir, you'll have to step back," said one of the agents. "It's all right," another voice interjected. Kurt didn't recognize the speaker, but the man obviously knew him. He introduced himself. "Trent MacDonald out of Langley." Kurt recognized the name, recalling that MacDonald was the first person at the CIA to share any information regarding Sienna's possible survival. They shook hands. "Thanks for your help," Kurt said. "Got yourself quite a fish by the look of things." "Not as big as the one you bagged," MacDonald admitted. "But we're happy. We passed the information your friend gave us to the FBI. Fortunately, they were able to grab Forrester before he took off for a country with no extradition treaty." One more point in Callista's favor, Kurt thought. So what part did he play in all of this? "Forrester was Brevard's inside man," MacDonald explained. "All of the financial maneuvering ran through him. He used his contacts to plant the computer viruses at the Federal Reserve, compromising the main system and the accounting protocols. He also set up a network of shell corporations that would have made it virtually impossible to track the money once it was moved." Kurt wasn't surprised. "And if that's not enough, he's been controlling Westgate," MacDonald added, "with an implant in Westgate's brain, making sure he didn't remember too much too soon." That put a new light on the confrontation at the Smithsonian. "I knew this guy was a snake from the moment I met him," Kurt said. "First impressions," MacDonald said. Kurt nodded and looked past Forrester out the window, where he could see FBI agents clearing the plane, looking for evidence. As they worked, the first sign of daylight appeared, and the high clouds were brushed with the slightest hint of pink. Apparently it was morning after all. Kurt looked back at Forrester, who glared back at him without a trace of remorse. "Might want to enjoy the sunrise," Kurt said coldly. "You're not going to see many more where you're going." A twitch ran across Forrester's cheek, but that was his only response. It was enough. Kurt turned back to Trent MacDonald, shook hands once again, and then continued on his way. He left the terminal and stood at the curb, wondering just how long he'd have to wait for the shuttle to long-term parking. Before he could hazard a guess, he spotted a familiar-looking black Jeep coming his way. His Jeep. It pulled up and stopped right in front of him. As the driver's door opened, Anna Erickson's pretty face, flaxen blonde hair, and beaming smile popped up over the roof. "Did you take up auto theft while I was gone?" Kurt asked. She laughed.
With all your memory problems, I thought you might have a hard time finding your car in the parking lot when you got back."
Kurt pretended to be hurt, but he honestly couldn't remember driving to the airport 2 weeks earlier. "You might be onto something," he said, and then added, "Sorry for how I behaved. I wasn't exactly myself."
"I realize that," she said. "I crossed a line, too. Any interest in starting over?"
"Nothing would make me happier," he said. She jumped down, came around the Jeep, and offered her hand.
"Hi,"
she said, as if meeting him for the first time.
"I'm Anna Erickson. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm not allowed to date my patients."
He shook her hand. "Kurt Austin. Fortunately, I no longer need a shrink." He opened the passenger door for her and asked, "Mind if I drive?" She settled into the passenger's seat as Kurt made his way to the driver's side and got behind the wheel. "Where to?" he asked.
"Somewhere we can look out at the river,"
she said coyly. He shut the door, put the Jeep in gear, and pulled away from the curb, smiling. "I know just the place," he said. "And the best part is, we'll be the only guests." That is the end of Ghost Ship. It was written by Clive Cussler and Graham Brown, and read by Jeff Harding. This has been an ISIS Audiobooks presentation. Previous titles by ISIS from these authors include 0 Hour, The Storm, Devil's Gate. For further details of our extensive catalog of unabridged audiobooks, please call our free phone number, 0800-731-5637, or visit our website, www.isis-publishing.co.uk.